Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be answering different questions from some listeners. So we're going to go through 3 different questions that were emailed into us, and we're going to try to answer them as best as we can. All right, first question. Hi, Sam. I've been listening to your podcast and really appreciate the insight into the admissions process and necessary strategy to stand out in a sea of applications. I especially enjoyed the deep dives you did with the engineering kid turned sports management and the rejected pre-med case study. Wondering if you could do an episode on a humanities-focused kid and what your advice regarding a hook would be for an English/political science major who hopes to go pre-law and has an internship at a law firm not secured by mom and dad. Is the goal to abandon any talk of pre-law and instead focus on a niche concentration in English or poli-sci? My daughter is a junior and I'm trying to help her form a hook with her extensive humanities-based resume, primarily in English and creative writing and secondarily in political science and law. Thank you for your podcast. Okay. So there's some different considerations here. One is what's the timeline? How close is the student to actually applying to college? That's one big driver of what the hook's going to be and the story and the positioning. So for the earlier stages of the process, if you're in 7th, 8th, 9th, maybe to a lesser extent, 10th grade, that phase is really a lot more story building. You are building, in a lot of cases, much more from a blank canvas and with less information, less certainty maybe about the student's academic interests, less to work with in their resume. At that point, it's a little bit less clear or less dictated, and you're sort of trying to nail down a hook, but you don't have to be thinking as much about like the very, very specific majors and how it's exactly going to be calibrated and put into the application. That phase of the process is more what we refer to as strategic positioning, and that's sort of the late stage, right? And sort of viewing that as more like a matching game of what's the resume that the student has assembled throughout their high school career, and on a school-by-school basis, what majors does this resume best match up with? Now, when you're earlier on, you can think about the hook in terms of majors, and that is useful to some extent. But I think we generally find that it's more useful to think of the students, their story building earlier on before you get to the application. You have to really think specifically about what majors you're applying for because you have to put them in the school supplements. And then, of course, in many of the applications, you have to check off the boxes. But before you get to that point, I think it's much more useful to be thinking, what problem am I trying to solve? What's a cause I'm devoted to? And so it doesn't have to be very specifically majors that you're thinking about in the earlier grades. It could be that some student is interested in, again, the intersection or the application of computer science to social entrepreneurship, and they're leveraging their coding background for social entrepreneurship, right? Social entrepreneurship isn't even a major at nearly any college. Some cases, very rarely, it might be a minor or certificate, some lesser degree offering. The structure of the business program is going to vary. Does the school even have an undergraduate business program? Does it have a liberal arts curriculum, even besides liberal arts colleges? But there are schools that are universities, but they have primarily a liberal arts, curriculum. They do not have a business major or undergraduate business school per se. And so it's useful to reverse engineer from the application backwards to the student's resume. But I find that there are a lot of mistakes when people do that. Also, when they start reverse engineering way too long term, like when they start reverse engineering from like the kid's career for the rest of their life, right? And so I think a lot of times, I mentioned this, I think in the How to Build an Admissions Hook episode, a lot of people, once they hear this notion of sort of developing a focused passion, a focused narrative for college, they're like, okay, well, I want my kid to be an investment banker, so then I have to back into that this way. They're jumping too far ahead, and that's not necessarily what you have to do. It's not totally the wrong logic, but it really sets up a lot of liabilities. A lot of people become overwhelmed because now the student feels like they're picking their whole career path. It sets up a lot of unnecessary strategic liabilities. For example, I've mentioned with pre-med, and this similar logic will apply to this question with pre-law. You're not applying to law school at age 18. You're not applying to med school at age 18. And so I've called this a dominated strategy. There's just dominated strategy in game theory. I've mentioned this multiple times on the podcast. It's a strategy that basically in the payoff matrix, it has no upsides. That strategy, it only has downsides. And so students labeling themselves as, I want to be a doctor and commoditizing their application by just lumping themselves in with a lot of all the other students who also say that they want to be pre-med, who, by the way, are not going to get by on the pre-med track. A lot of those kids, for better or for worse, they're going to get weeded out. right? Like biology is one of the most regretted college majors. A lot of people think that they're going to be a doctor because there's all these societal default biases. Traditionally, it's been a more prestigious profession. It sounds good when you tell people, but a lot of people are not going to make it through. I don't know exactly what the percentage is of people who say they want to be pre-med going to college who actually even get into med school, but it's not good. It's not high. It's in that case, if you sort of position yourself as a pre-med major and you just commoditize your application, a lot of those people aren't even going to be doctors anyway. And so you might have just ended up at a worse college for no reason, right? And there was no upside. You didn't have to tell them you wanted to be a doctor because it's not changing what college or what undergraduate school you're going into anyway. There is no undergraduate medical school, right? So there's no upside. There's no necessity to telling them that you want to be a doctor. And there's more interesting, more creative and clever ways. If you have built a health profession related resume, there's just a lot of other health related positioning that you can spin off instead of just going down the very traditional path of, saying that you want to be a doctor. As here's another kid who says that they want to be a doctor, who's watched, Grey's Anatomy. It's like, it's like rolling your eyes as an admissions officer. It's very similar logic with pre-law. It's, again, there's just no necessity. It's not as if they're sort of saying, okay, if you didn't declare that you want to be pre-law at 18, then you're not going to be able to take these law classes that don't even exist in the first place, right? You're not getting any upside out of telling them that. Those are some of the liabilities of anchoring too far into the future with certain career paths. Now, if you're talking about business or engineering, it's a little bit different, right? Business and engineering, you might need to know a little bit earlier on because there are programs, there are schools where you do need to get directly admitted to business or you're never getting into the business school at that college. Michigan, for example, is one with Ross. It's direct admit as a freshman. You can internally transfer later on. So there are internal transfers. It depends by the college. There are schools that they have deferred admit and you can go in at a later date. UNC, for example, UVA, McIntyre. It gets very complex with business because there's all different sorts of setups. Then if you're at Duke, there is no undergraduate business school. There's only engineering and there's the liberal arts college. There is no formal undergraduate business major. Same thing for a lot of Ivies. Business really depends. It depends, what type of colleges you're looking at. You might have to make a much earlier decision and be able to position yourself to be a freshman admit. And some of these schools, again, they're going to have strictures. It could be very difficult to internally transfer. Same thing with engineering. Engineering can be a lot harder to internally transfer. It depends on the school. Engineering is also very technical. So if you're going through college and you're not really going through the curriculum early enough, that could be a problem. So business and engineering tend to be a little bit more rigid and there's just a lot of complexities. It's hard to go through every single situation for every single school and whether it has a business program, whether it doesn't, is it deferred admit, is it freshman admit, what's the internal transfer rate? It's very complex and beyond the scope of this episode. Business and engineering, you need to really think about that a lot earlier on in a lot of cases. For pre-law and pre-med, again, you're just going to liberal arts college regardless. Circling back to my main point, when you're in the much earlier phases, you need to be developing an in the vicinity narrative. You want to be saying, okay, I'm interested in leveraging these two fields together. And I'm sort of in that, but you also need to be flexible and pliable to opportunities that come through. Some opportunity might be a better opportunity and you sort of push your resume a little bit towards, that side. If you're trying to be very niche, as I talk about in this podcast a lot, that can reduce the number of, for example, if you're trying to get a research position, that can reduce the surface area for opportunities. And it's not as though like there's just professors lined up waiting for you to declare, that like you're going to dictate what the niche theme of this project is going to be, right? So in some cases, you do need to sort of bend your positioning to some extent. You need to have a path for sure. And we're always going to start off trying to make it a niche, an intersection, but it's still flexible. It's evolving over time. By the time you get to the later stages, now that's the real strategic positioning. That's the real like matching of what you have in your resume to the actual majors that you're applying for. A lot of people, again, they're too worried about it too early on in the process. Now, for the student, they are in the later stages. And the reason why that is important to note is they're getting closer to sort of what I refer to as the strategic positioning part, right? Their resume now is a lot more fixed and they need to just best strategically match it to the majors or the offerings at the particular college. Now, in terms of the student has an extensive humanities-based resume, primarily in English and creative writing, and secondarily in political science and law. So we don't know what this resume is. I can't score this resume. I'm not sure exactly what the student has done, right? If this is like when we say an extensive humanities-based resume, is that just like the student writes for the school newspaper and like, these are kind of low middle tier activities, or they've been the editor of the school newspaper since freshman year. They launched all sorts of, columns. They got extra funding for the newspaper, right? And so I talked about this in the 10 Ways to Build an Admissions Hook episode. A lot of this comes down to the depth, the initiative of the actual activities. Has the student done English, research with an English professor? That might sound crazy because everybody thinks research is about, science or experimental or lab-based research or trying to cure cancer. Professors do research in every single discipline, right? So has there been any English research or literary analysis? Has the student started a workshop program for teaching students creative writing and started scaling it? What the specifics are would really govern a lot of what you're going to do strategically here. If the student has a very strong English and creative writing resume, you can totally just position and apply for that. The way that I think about the positioning and the selection of the majors, the term that I often use, I think I've maybe used this on the podcast before, you're picking the filter or the lens that subsumes the greatest amount of variance in the student's resume. So what on earth does that mean, Sam? Subsumes the greatest amount of variance is you have all of this variance in the student's resume, right? A lot of people do, right? So they have some English or creative writing, political science, law. They're going to probably have played a sport at some point in time before they listen to the podcast and drop their sport because they realize it's not doing anything for their college admissions and it's not the 1980s anymore. You're not going to usually look at a student's resume, like it's perfectly, there's like 18 activities that are all perfectly aligned with the hook. Right? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to pick the filter or the lens that is the positioning, the strategic positioning, or the majors that you're listing in the application, right? Tentatively, you're not making a major declaration at this point in time. Very often you'll do that by the end of sophomore year in college, but you are trying to look at all the activities. And if you sort of want to do this, and if this listener wants to do this, or if anybody wants to do this at home, take everything. Make sure you write down every last thing the student has done in their resume, right? And people all the time miss little things. They miss little hobbies. They miss little, I hate the word passion projects, because again, it sounds like a gimmick for college admissions, but it just things that the student has done, some little initiative. They called a local politician and they tried to do this initiative, or just little things that a lot of people just forget in their resume. And we had a student in the fall, we did an episode, application strategy for high school senior, and that student had some really interesting informal hobbies. So they were building model rockets was one. People might remember that, right? And that was great because it really conveyed this intellectual vitality. The student didn't ultimately have enough to position for engineering, but something like that could be lost. We had a student several years back who was big into historical shipwreck diving, and that was really cool, really unique, really differentiating, and it related to their passion for history. Now, can you put that in the activities list in the Common App as a super formal activity with like this number of weeks and like this leadership? No, but it can go in the additional information section, right? Because it was a very cool, interesting activity. And then you sort of put bullets and you talk about it, etc. So you have to write down on paper, you need to make sure you have everything this kid has ever done. And even if the student did something, I think we pulled this strategy off for the student with the Stanford application review. I think they had some stuff that was in middle school, maybe some awards. And technically in the Common App, if you're in the activities list, those are supposed to be from high school, right? But in the additional information section, there is no specification. So like you can sort of game this a little bit. And if you did have an award or something that was impressive, but it predated high school, you can still put it in the additional information section. Right. And you may just leave out exactly when it happened because like you're just trying to do the most for your candidacy. And so you want to write out everything that you've basically accomplished, all of your activities, and then you want to start coming up with labels or keywords or categories for those, right? What umbrellas do they fall under? One category might be English. One category might, and I did this in the Stanford application review episode as well, right? We sort of looked at the student. We said, which ones of these are related to mobility tech and which ones of these are related to diabetes technology? And then we sort of went through and under each of those columns for each of those positions, positionings, sort of list the number of activities, what's the quality of the activities, etc. And so, for a student like this, you might sort of create an English header. You might create a creative writing or English and creative writing and say, well, there's 4 activities that I have in my resume under English and creative writing, right? And then also, what's the value of them? Like, how deep are they, right? Because if it's 4, but they're like low-level activities, it's like, I was a member of the newspaper, or, I did some very informal research project, it's like something that's not very impressive. You have to take that into account as well. So it needs to be the quality and the quantity under a given label or a given column, a given sort of positioning strategy. And then you might take the political science and the law and you sort of put how many you have under that. Then you might sort of say, this is really big. And again, going back to the Stanford application review episode, this is really important, is nexus activities. If you're going to be at an intersection or interdisciplinary, it's very important to have these glue activities, these nexus activities that unite. If you have 2 big categories, so I called this in the Stanford application review episode, I called this a bimodal candidacy. Bimodal distribution is a distribution that has 2 big peaks, 2 highest frequency points. And so let's say the student had, if you did the English and the creative writing category, they have 5 under that one, and then they have 5 under the political science and law. It's not super ideal. So I've mentioned that you really want to break down the wall. You can sort of be like, here's the 5 that I did in English and creative writing. Here's the 5 I did in political. And so, I'm applying for English number 1. It's a little bit disjointed. It's not totally suboptimal, but it is still suboptimal. You would like to have some glue or some nexus activities in there. So for example, if you had an English and creative writing student and who's also interested in political science and law, the problem here is at the student's much later stage. So it's not easy to develop these things at this point in time. You're getting much closer to the strategic positioning end of the spectrum, which is the matching of what you have in your resume, since it's mostly fixed at this point in time and unchangeable. You just mash it to the majors or pick the best filters, basically, through which you want to see the resume, right? To make sure that it's relevant and it makes sense. There's a continuity between the resume and what the student's saying that they want to apply for and what they're writing in their essays. But if you were much earlier on and you sort of said, I have this English and creative writing interest, but I also have this law interest, you could do something interesting with, narratives in the law, media, or written portrayals of high-profile legal cases. Go writing as literary texts, where you're analyzing tone, structure, metaphor, storytelling in the courtroom, right? Very interesting. I think we know that a lot of law is performance, right? It's actors, it's lawyers, it's, charisma, it's the way that they frame stories, it's the way that they present the witnesses, etc., etc. You could do stuff like law and literature movements, novels or plays, plus legal systems, To Kill a Mockingbird, Antigone, The Trial, how writers critique or convey justice systems through fiction. You could do, this is much more like not really English or creative writing or literature per se, but if you did have an interest in grammar, which would be quite niche, this isn't really what English is at the college level. It's not grammar, it's much more literature and textual analysis. There's some very interesting court cases. There was the Oakhurst dairy case in Maine from 2017 that the ruling, some may have heard this, the ruling basically turned on the interpretation of a serial comma or the Oxford comma. Right. So sort of that final comma before you have, a conjunction like or and. Right. And so it was all of this controversy because it was very ambiguous what the ruling was. I believe it was truck drivers. And I think they were suing for overtime or, what counted for overtime. And the way that the agreement was written, it was just not clear because of the punctuation. So it's thinking of these really clever and creative intersections. No, this student's very late. So they probably can't go build the resume per se at the intersection to sort of connect or create this nexus between these 2 interests. And again, this is why it matters what's the timeline for the student. However, that being said, this picture that I'm painting here, these sort of cool intersections between law and English, you can still put some of this in your, in your essays, right? Or intellectual vitality. It doesn't always have to just be, there could be some intellectual concept that fascinates you. So you can still use some of this content in the application essays, but to actually build a resume around it or at the intersection with one of these themes would just be a lot more challenging at this point in time. So, really what you want to do is you would have to look at the student's resume and sort of say, Is it 7 activities that lean toward English and creative writing? And those are where all the most high quality ones are, the ones where they had more leadership. They were school newspaper editor for 3 years. All of the factors that I've sort of described, again, in the 10 ways to build a missions hook episode, factors that drive value are continuity, how long, what's the depth, the investment, so it's going to be depth, which is also, leadership is one of those. How relevant is it to the narrative? But relevance, you can determine, you get to dictate relevance. And a lot of people just don't think about this correctly. You can make your resume relevant to what you're applying for by virtue of just choosing the majors that best match your resume. Right? And a lot of people just don't do this correctly. They're like, I think I want to be a lawyer, so then I'm going to put political science, because again, they're looking future oriented. They need to be looking retrospectively and saying, the future doesn't matter, right? It's just like, you're going to put this major, but you're going to liberal arts college regardless. And there is no law path as an undergraduate. So it doesn't make any difference. You can go change it when you get to the college. It's just looking retrospectively and saying, well, this filter or this lens, again, subsumes the greatest amount of variance, and not even just variance or the greatest number of activities, but the greatest number of also high value activities as well. So if we were to write out that English and creative writing column, and there's 7 in that category, and there's like 4 of them that are really high value, right? The student did a writing workshop program and scaled it, or again, there's more of their leadership or their depth or their continuity. And then you are sort of to draw the political science of the law column, and there's like 2, and one of them's like this law firm internship. And you're sort of like, this started very late. They got it right next to the application. How much do they really contribute? Is there like a lot of really interesting, unique contributions, which, a lot of these internships, particularly, sort of in an applied context, this is one of the problems with shadowing and the medical field is, what are you going to do in the hospital? Like, do you think they're going to like let you operate on patients? Like, there's just a limited capacity as a high schooler to really contribute or have high value contributions, particularly in applied contexts, right? So like at a law firm, it's like a serious business, right? To be at a hospital, it's like they're not handing you the scalpel or having you, read the x-rays. So, in that case, you could do other stuff that's high value. Research, tends to be a little bit more flexible. If you get the right research opportunity, there's more flexibility or pliability to make high value contributions than there are sometimes in a more applied context. A big company, you're at a big law firm, you're at a hospital. It's like, maybe like there are definitely students who pull it off. I'm not saying it can't be done, but there are some structural limitations in certain contexts to what a high schooler can accomplish. So we also talked about one of the previous episodes, the Stanford episode, the student who's trying to get a Neuralink position, which would have been amazing, but you can't always get stuff like that. Sometimes you can, and you'd be surprised. And we've had students who work at NASA as high schoolers. They made pretty significant contributions on a project at NASA, but it really depends sort of what the context is in the field and sort of where you're put into. Those people who are supervising you, are they more amenable to your contributions, et cetera, et cetera. You have to work your way up, build trust. It's not always possible when you're doing a late stage internship at a big company and law firm, and it's like you're mostly, who knows, shuttling coffee back and forth. So yes, we would have to look at what's the breakdown between these 2 different columns, 2 different fields, what's both the quantity and the quality. If it did end up being the case that the student, again, had much more towards the English and the creative writing, which is what I would significantly prefer, because it's the better strategic positioning than political science and law. And there's no real necessity in telling them you want to be a lawyer. And again, I would avoid these labels. Like, pick something more niche that you say that you want to do, like you want to work in a public policy think tank or be a policy analysis, just something that's just less likely to be what other students are saying. So the way that I think about this is like Family Feud. It's like there's a certain number of survey, respondents. You don't want to be the highest number, you want to be the lowest number. You want to think, what is everybody else in the application pool going to say? I want to be a lawyer, I want to be an engineer, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a business person, I want to do investment banking, I want to consult, whatever, right? And you want to like move orthogonal to that, right? And you want to avoid that as much as you possibly can, which I've covered extensively on this podcast. So I would much prefer, I'd be much more thrilled if we did this analysis and it was much more, and they are saying the resume is primarily in English and creative writing and showing secondarily in political science and law. That is strategically preferable. And there's a big disparity. There's a lot more English and creative writing, both quantity, but then again, also quality. You might even honestly just consider, and a lot of people just can't do this because they don't have the like guts to do it. But if it ended up that there was only like 2 or 3 political science or law related activities in the student's resume, one of them was like a late stage internship, but they didn't have major contributions, I would just potentially cut it out from the application, just not include it at all. Right. And so you're like, oh my God, it's like, they spent this whole internship. Right. And I talked in the last episode about a student we had several years ago who played, 4 years of varsity golf, and told him, you're not putting this in the application. It's not accomplishing anything. The only thing it's accomplishing is like showing that you're a private school kid who's privileged and played a country club sport for 4 years. Doesn't do anything. Zero. And in fact, I would argue and did argue it was a net negative. And the student's fine. They're at like a top 5 college right now. They didn't include it in the application. So you can also not include things in the application. I just want to remind people of that. If you have sports in your application, you're not a recruited athlete, those go very far down the list, and you have to start to worry about dilution of the themes of the application, right? It's like if you have 4 relevant activities in your activities list, and now it's like I'm reading a bunch of sports and things that are irrelevant, you start diluting the narrative, and you also start diluting the value of the activities, because it's like you have 4 really good ones, but now you feel the compulsion to fill up your activities list with 6 other low value, irrelevant activities, and you start getting this value dilution, this relevance dilution, this hook dilution in your application, right? And again, you're working with a human being with very fallible, limited working memory. You don't want to confuse them. You want to stay on task with the through line in your application. You don't want to start throwing stuff just because, I was a cashier at Target. It's like, anybody ever read the resumes where this drives me insane, where people put like things from when they were 14 in their resume? It's like 6 pages. You're like, what the heck is this? Right? It's like, this has nothing to do with the job. Right? So you don't need to do that. It's another note for people as well. You don't need to include everything. Now, if the student had to, there was some big consequence of them not declaring, it's like either by 18 you decided that you were on the law track or not, well then, yeah, you would have to tell them, obviously, right? But that's just not the case in the American education system. There's just no big upside. In fact, there's a downside. Law would be the worst, right? Any pre-professional field that's very common, very, prestigious, profession, a lot of people are going to against law. It's business, it's medicine, it's engineering, it's computer science nowadays, or technology. It's just like, there's like 5 or 6, right, that are big ones. Then there are some that sort of fall into like maybe tier 2 that are very common, like psychology. There's some other ones as well. But law and the pre-professional, you generally, I would say, want to stay away from the most. It's just not necessary. It's not a major. Political science, it's not getting the most undersubscribed major in the world, but it's also not going to be like computer science or some extremely oversubscribed, but it's still not like the most unique, right? And so we would definitely prefer the English or creative writing from a strategic perspective. It's going to be fewer kids are going to be applying for this. And so what I would really prefer, but you just don't know how this works out. You have to do the analysis, right? You have to draw out the columns. You have to write out the categories and the labels and see how many activities are the contributions and the depth and the value of the activities. But if it did end up being the case that the student did have more and then also higher value activities under the English and creative writing lens, you want to push the filter towards that, because again, it subsumes the greatest amount of variance, meaning it subsumes the greatest number of activities in the student's resume through that filter. And then also you want it to subsume the greatest amount of, I would say, higher value activities as well, ideally, but without seeing exactly what the breakdown is and sort of scoring and ranking what the depth is of the activities. It's hard to sort of do this analysis, but that would be more ideal. And if it were the case, again, the political science or law were just so few in quantity, or they just weren't really very impressive activities, you would just consider cutting your losses and maybe not even including them in the application at all, because it's just the English and the creative writing is better. It's much better and much more strategically positioning. And so you play up your English. If the student built a mostly English and creative writing resume throughout high school, because that's what they're really good at, and there's intersections with law anyway, right? Writing in law and argument and rhetoric, and I showed the intersections. They can just apply for that. They put that in the application, no big deal. Once they get to the college, or even the second after they get in, a lot of times, you can switch your major, you can file an appeal to switch the school. So it's just not a big deal, right? You can pick that English and creative writing and then go the political science route if you want to. Now, I will say, even for law school and for med school, you still do want to be thinking about the strategic positioning long term. You have to make sure that you're accumulating requisite skills at an undergraduate level. if you are a philosophy major undergraduate, you end up applying for medical school and you don't have any of the prerequisites. Obviously, that's a big issue. However, that being said, it's much more interesting as a med school admissions committee to be reviewing the application of a philosophy major who's positioning for med school than it is to just be reviewing yet another biology major. So this sort of strategic positioning notion also will apply for graduate school or basically any context, any job application. It's just like the people kind of come out of left field and you're like, why is this philosophy major applying to med school, right? It's interesting, it's compelling, it's surprising, and that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to sort of shock them out of the boredom of just like seeing the same thing. You're trying to log prediction errors. The brain is a prediction machine. If things just sort of follow as you neatly predicted them, it doesn't sort of create this big learning spike where it's like, oh, I need to take notice of this because this is really different, right? This is something that's not inspected from the environment. I would also say maybe a student wants to do political science undergraduate major, but there is no set undergraduate major for law school, right? You could be a philosophy major, you could be an English major, and it's less important even so versus medical school, where medical school, again, there's a more rigid set of prerequisites. So it's not even something you want to get in for English and creative writing, because that's the better filter through which you just sort of to understand their resume and their positioning strategy. But even when they get to college, they might not want to just be yet another political science major who's going to end up applying to law school, because then even at that second level for graduate school, it's still not even, again, it's just that it's like analogous to biology and medicine, right? It makes sense and it's commonsensical, but the fact that it's commonsensical or traditional is also what makes it not unique. But yes, this student can totally make a high degree of use of their English and creative writing. I would really, really prefer, this is when you're going through students, what they have accomplished, and you're like, there are some students where they happen to have been very aligned with what the most strategic thing is. Now, the opposite of that would be the student has very little under the English and creative writing resume, which would be more strategic, and they have a lot under, I wouldn't even say maybe like the worst would be not even just political science, but it's like very clearly tied to like law, because again, you're just hitting these very common pre-professional paths. That would be sort of the worst end of the strategic spectrum, because then you can't sort of get away. You can't just make over your resume from scratch. And what I've described on the podcast, a student wouldn't be able to do this really at this point in time in actual resume, but they could change how they frame it. But if you are in a very competitive area, if you're in computer science, if you're in business, etc., it puts a lot more onus on you, since that top line positioning, as I refer to it, business is sort of the top line positioning. The bottom line positioning, or what I refer to as the net positioning, would be something that's like very drilled into like a niche, right? So I've mentioned like social entrepreneurship's fine, but again, there's a lot of people even increasingly are starting to go into the social entrepreneurship angle. It would be like social entrepreneurship for like a very specific cause, for a very specific avatar, and like you need to drill into that top line positioning as much as possible. What you're trying to do is get as close as you can to being 1 out of 1. Like, there's nobody else in the applicant pool. If you were looking at business, of course, there's going to be a lot of kids. The top line positioning is not very unique. But if you're in business, and then you're in entrepreneurship, and then you're in social entrepreneurship, and then it's not even just social, but it's like with this very specific who make uniforms for like kids in Uganda. There's a lot of other problems with that. Amir was the best example with the conspicuous compassion that I've mentioned, and a lot of people do that with, underprivileged children, etc. So you got to be careful, because that's going to also be very cliche. But if you can drill into some very specific avatar that's just very unique. And I showed this a little bit. If you were to, analyze media, written portrayals of high-profile legal cases, like there aren't going to be a lot of kids who are doing in the applicant pool who are applying to college. And you're drilling really deep into something and getting very niche. That's really important when your top-line positioning is very poor or suboptimal or just very common or non-unique. On this spectrum here, the English and the creative writer would be the most strategically ideal. The other end of the spectrum would be the law is sort of like less ideal, because it's just going to be more common as a pre-professional path. Again, it would depend on what the breakdown is. If this student is just sort of, it's like 5 and 5, or let's say it's 3 and 3, they sort of have 3 English and creative writing activities, and 1 or 2 of them are maybe pretty high value. And then they have like 3 political science or law activities, and, 1 or 2 of them is maybe high value, and just sort of like you're exactly that bimodal candidacy, then yes, you can't really then just make it an English or creative writing positioning strategy, because you'd be cutting out too much value from your resume. That would be very difficult, because if you did have an extra 2 high value activities and, say 3 or 4 overall in the political political science or law column, well, it would really injure your application at that point in time to cut out like half of the potentially relevant activities and half of the potentially higher value activities. So it really depends, again, what that breakdown is going to be. So I would say, again, if English and creative writing if the quantity and the quality of activities are much more leaning towards that, you might even just consider pushing all your chips towards that. And maybe you put in the law internship. Again, it really depends. You have to really see all the activities and you see all the nuances of the student's case, and then you just see the colleges they're applying to, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard to really do this in abstract. Maybe you put it in, but it's like towards the bottom of the activities list, but it's like you're mostly just positioning for English, relevant and creative writing. If it's sort of 5 and 5 or 3 and 3, then you're going to need to play this more bimodal game where you need to put both majors, English and political science. If there's something that is a more unique major than just, again, political science, that you can still find a way to connect to your resume, go that route. Don't just choose, again, always try to be more unique versus less unique. For example, if a school offered cognitive science instead of neuroscience, and you can connect your interest to cognitive science just as well as you connect them to neuroscience, but cognitive science is just not going to draw as many applicants, as most kids don't even know what the heck that is, then, go with cognitive science because it's going to be a little bit more rare, a little bit more unique. And if you need to familiarize yourself a little bit with what the major is or what the offerings are, then, so be it, but find more interesting matches for your resume versus, again, more overly subscribed or more very common or pre-professional paths if you can. But if the student's candidacy is very bimodal like this and it's pretty equally distributed across these two different angles or these two columns, then yes, you might have to apply for both English and, political science, or if you can find something that's related to political science a little bit more unique and still connects to the resume, then you could do that as well. There's nothing wrong with English or creative writing because it's just not going to be very common or popular. So it's just inherently more strategically viable. And so you would have to sort of play it via 2 different majors or 3 different majors to sort of get at the resume and subsume the variance in the resume through those 2 or 3 different filters. It's much better if you can subsume the variance through one filter. So I mentioned cognitive science, for example. Cognitive science is already an interdisciplinary mesh of fields, right? You have some computer science, you have some linguistics, you have some philosophy, some neuroscience, some psychology. So that's a little bit more ideal because in one major, you're able to subsume a greater amount of variance from a student's resume. But sometimes you can't necessarily do that, and you do have to pick different majors to sort of chip away at the variance of the resume and sort of say, okay, I've got to list 2 different majors here because that's the best way that I can fit in all of my resume in this situation, because it is fairly equally distributed and there is no interdisciplinary major per se. Like social entrepreneurship would be another one. You had a student, if she started a lot later, again, this is the liabilities of starting the process later, is you can't sort of architect this from a much earlier stage. There's a lot more gamesmanship in that strategic positioning phase, which is later and closer to the application in terms of how it gets actually packaged. It's not that you can't do it, but there's always going to be limited upside to what you can do when you didn't have the canvas, from scratch, basically. And we saw this with the Stanford application review episode. There were some very compelling themes that could have been substantiated or evidenced in the student's resume from a much earlier age, and they just weren't there, and you just can't build a resume when you're late in junior year and about to apply to college, unfortunately. You can take 2 different majors and, sort of try to chip away at the themes that way as well. You can also try to use the essays to talk about the intersection, of some of these themes or this interest. It's less ideal, but there is that sort of bimodal path. You generally would want to avoid the law or anything that's very just like oversubscribed or common or pre-professional if you can. But again, if that would force you to cut out really high value activities or multiple activities from your resume, the risk reward might not make sense there. So it really depends. So I sort of talked about 2 situations, then I'll talk about a third situation. So the first situation was the student's resume leans heavily English and creative writing. It's already leaning towards the most strategically conducive path. Right? The higher value activities are more disproportionately under English and creative writing. The quantity is more disproportionate under English and creative writing. And so that should take the predominant filter, right? So that would be like, maybe it's like there's 8 under that and they're all high value and there's only like 2 or 1 under political science and law. And then you might even just consider jettisoning the entire political science or law angle because it's so weak or so diluted. It's creating risk because it's creating a very common field that other students will be interested in. If it's more like in the middle, between the two, then you'll probably have to take the two major approach, the bimodal approach. You want to break down the wall as much as you can between the two different fields in your resume. You want to make sense of them or intersect them or create nexus points. You won't be able to do in all likelihood through your resume at this point in time, being a later stage junior, but you can do it in the essays. You can talk about how you sort of see English relating to political science, or, all the different intersections, law and literature, narrative in the law, implication of writing for legal outcomes or judicial decisions, or you can put some of that in the essays. The essays are a bit of a container for you making sense of items in your application that seem disparate on their surface. But if you have more time to talk about them, you can illustrate the connections, the hidden connections that wouldn't be clear from just a very limited amount of space that you have to articulate your resume. Now, the third sort of situation I would consider here would be if the resume is actually lopsided, but it's much more towards the political science or law, which it doesn't sound like. But if that were the case, and, there are just kids who happen to build their resume and it's not around the more undersubscribed or more strategically viable path, so you can't cut out their whole resume. If it ended up that it's like 3 English and creative writing activities and it's like 7 political science and law related activities, first of all, again, try to diminish the significance as much as possible, connecting it to wanting to be a lawyer and the professional, connecting just the liberal arts and what they're actually, going to study at the college and research and more of that. Again, because a lot of the other students are going to be thinking career-oriented, these very common career paths. But if it were much more weighted towards the political science and that category, well, then you got to kind of run with it, because you can't cut out, if that were 7 of your 10 activities and it's got 4 high value ones that are in that domain, then you can't shoot yourself in the foot. You're going to go with that and make the most that you can out of it. And in that case, then you're under a little bit more, again, if it's political science, it depends what the sort of the natures of the activities, what sort of themes you abstract more specifically. And again, you'd be looking for maybe not political science, but maybe something that's kind of like political science, but it's, again, a little bit more undersubscribed. This depends by the school. It's just going to depend by the school, what they offer. Their certificates, are their minors, they have this weird major at this one school, which is like very niche and unique. And then you can also convey this, in your essays by the clubs that you connect it to, that you're going to convey that you're going to partake in at the college and the research you're going to do, and go find a political, science professor or somebody in a department who's doing a very niche or specific research on, sort of a poli-sci related topic or law-related topic, and you can sort of, convey the positioning that way. But if the top line positioning's weaker or more strategically disadvantaging, then you need to be more niche or more specific. So I wouldn't just be thinking political science, but like, what's a specific cause that's been conveyed by the student's resume? What can they write about this very specific cause that they want to devote themselves to in the essay? What's like a very specific research topic in political science or law that they would want to study with a professor at the college? Like, you can't just be the kid who's like, I want to do business because I'm good at numbers. It's just all this stupid cliche nonsense. You have to, especially again, if the top line positioning is weaker, you need to drill into it and really think about not just political science or I want to be a lawyer, but what's like a very specific cause, what's a very specific problem under that umbrella that you have devoted yourself to or you can draw out of your resume. You're going to need to drill deeper because, again, that top line major and that umbrella is just not as undersubscribed. It's not as unique. They're going to have more applicants in that field. And so therefore that puts more pressure on uniqueness versus if you are a linguistics major, it's like the top line positioning is unique already, right? Like it's just, you're not competing at a surface level with very many other students, right? And there are probably some people who are like, okay, we'll just be a linguistics major. Well, you have to build a linguistics resume. So you have to actually like linguistics and know what the heck it is for 3 years. You can't just make up a major because it's undersubscribed at the end. Like that does not work. So that's what I'm saying here. Again, that filter or those major lenses need to subsume the variance from the resume, both the quantity and the quality of the activity. So I've shown 3 different cases. One is it leans more English and creative writing. You might just put all of your chips honestly on that positioning, and then once you get to the school you can change your major whatever you want and you can go down your normal law school path if you so choose. If it's in the middle, you're probably going to take the double major approach. Always again be looking for uniqueness, more unique academic offerings afforded by the college that still match the themes of your resume and maybe some of those poli-sci themes, but if there's something a little bit more unique that you can convey, then the school has an academic offering. Certainly in terms of research, there's a lot of flexibility. Say I want to do research with this professor, there'll be a million different topics that you can choose from versus majors are going to be a little bit more rigid. There are a lot more clubs you can connect to. So if it's right in the middle, You might take sort of the double major approach or 2 or 3 that are sort of in the vicinity of both, because you need to subsume all the variance there and get all the value from both of them, because you can't cut out half of the value of your resume. And then if it's much more weighted towards the poli-sci or the law, it's the least strategically ideal. Again, be looking for something that's maybe a little bit more unique than just, political science, and be drilling in very deep to, again, niche areas of study or focus within poli-sci that you sort of maybe tackled very specifically, a very specific avatar, very specific legal issue, et cetera, et cetera. And then in that case, if it were very weighted towards the poli-sci and law, you would potentially have to put the filter a lot more towards that angle. But you could still put the creative writing, and you sort of have some writing stuff in there. You sort of fit that in as well, because it is going to be strategically more ideal. Again, I'm doing this mostly in abstract. You have to really know what the activities are, have them all written out, and really assess the value of the activities to sort of conduct the whole analysis here and exactly what to do. That was longer than I was expecting to expound on that email. Hopefully helpful to a lot of other people as well. Okay, second question. Hello, Sam. I just found your podcast and I'm catching up on all the old episodes. I just listened to episode 13, The Truth About Summer Programs, and you have now sufficiently convinced me to not send my son to. I'm going to redact some of the information here. They were going to send them to a top college for a summer course on. I'm going to redact the exact academic program. You mentioned that there are online courses from universities that he can take or audit online that would be considered legitimate and not have the opportunity cost as the in-person on-campus summer classes. You might have even used the phrase world-class or something similar. Can you list some? I don't know where to begin. You said Coursera several times, and I see that they do have material there. They then mentioned the school again, has a course catalog, but didn't sound like that was what you were referring to. For this type of subject matter, we want him to get exposure to the material that he wants to learn, but we want to make sure he's doing a course that has a good reputation. How does one evaluate the quality of the course? How to know if it is a good or a waste of precious time? Thank you for any advice you can provide. Okay, so the student sounds like they were registered for, sort of a summer program or summer course through one of the top colleges. As this listener is alluding to, I talked about the summer programs. A lot of summer programs at these top colleges just are not impressive to admissions officers. It's just they are associated with a top tier college name for branding purposes: Stanford, Cornell, Columbia, and a lot of them are not high value extracurriculars. A lot of them are just watered down college courses for high schoolers. There are vendors and third party, merchants and companies who sort of are licensing the college's brand name. It's not going to be a well respected high value extracurricular, but a lot of people still do them. They spend a lot of money on these programs. And so if you want to learn more or do the deeper dive, that was, at least it's this person, I don't recall off the top of my head, but they said it was episode 13. Title was The Truth About Summer Programs, that episode. So they're sort of saying, what do we do instead? If we've sort of, we sort of heard your episode about the summer programs and sort of listened and convinced us, to not do these, what do you do in lieu of that? So I'm going to go through 2 use cases for college courses or college-esque courses, because this is sort of what the student was going to do. A lot of these summer programs are just courses. And so I'm going to go through sort of 2 different use cases or 2 ways. And the listener is alluding to this when she said, for this type of subject matter, we want him to get exposure to the material that he wants to learn. So there's some sort of just intrinsic learning, right? It's like you want the kid to make sure that they're getting exposed to the content in their field and they're being taught well, they have good materials for their own sort of purposes and edification in this field, right? And so that's more like the intrinsic part of this, right? Or what I'll say is indirect candidacy building, right? It's intrinsic learning, vocational, building intellectual vitality, their fluency in this field. You have to have fluency for essays down the line. It's it's not grammar. It's how sophisticated are when you talk about your field. It's a very easy sign of whether a student really loves the field or they're passionate. How knowledgeable are they? So you're at the dinner table with your family and, a bunch of friends. How much can you talk about your topic or your hook? It's the kids who really stand out are they sound very clever and very smart and well-informed about the field that they're in. So there's that sort of indirect candidacy building, intellectual vitality, intrinsic learning. Then she's also referring to a course that has a good reputation, which also is more the extrinsic or sort of the outward appearance of the course for more admissions purposes. Whether that's what they were intending or not, that's sort of how I'll frame it. More the intrinsic, the quality of the contents on the back end, and then the extrinsic, or sort of the, let's call it the admissions officer facing perception of what you're doing. Now, for indirect candidacy building, just intrinsic learning, becoming fluent in your field, just understanding the concepts more. If you were going to go, God forbid, I'm just kidding, to go down the computer science commodity path that so many students are going down. No offense against it. Just, I think everybody knows my opinion. It's like, if you do want to do the computer science stuff, no problem. But like, just better find a way to either be the best at it or to make yourself very unique within that field. Again, given that the top line positioning is very weak, it still just blows my mind how many people there are in San Francisco and Silicon Valley who just don't understand. They're all overrepresented, saturated, all fall into the stereotype of the coding and the computer science path. It still blows my mind that people just literally walk right into that path. And they're like, from the most geographically overpopulated, saturated area, their parents are all in those fields, so you can see it in the application. They're then applying to the top tech colleges in Stanford. It's just like, they're all overrepresented ethnicities, like Asian and Indian, like applying for computers. It's just like, you can play that game, but like, you better be really good. You better be really good. A, just like you're trying to be the best, or B, you better find a way to make it really unique. Like, you better have really interesting ways of leveraging that coding or that comp sci background. I mentioned this in a lot of episodes. I have such a disdain for like total lack of strategy and just going straight into the first and foremost institutional strengths of the schools you're applying to and just being so expected and so predictable. But I'm going off on a tangent. That being said, if you are trying to learn computer science and coding and you need to develop the baseline proficiency and skill sets, like you're at the ground level of Mount Everest. A lot of kids are doing it much earlier on, from a much younger age, if it's coding in a lot of cases. If you're not, I don't really know what you're doing if you say that you're interested in it, because like you have unlimited resources, essentially. But, that's more like, for a lot of kids, it might be like they're in 7th, 8th grade, 9th grade. That's where, when this person is talking about Coursera courses, you could do edX, you could do an online course, like, that's just back end. It's like, you need to develop just basic competencies in your field, right? And so that's fine for sort of that back end, that, intrinsic learning. That's totally fine. And that may be fine for some of the early resume, again, when you're a lot younger. It's not going to do pretty much anything when you talk about it in terms of admissions officer facing. Like, there's not going to be admissions officers going to be like, oh my God, this student has Coursera class in their resume. It's like, that's not going to do anything for your application. So that's more of the back end, the indirect candidacy building. And you can learn whatever your field is. Like, you can go take a course, online that's like a free course, and you can watch the video lectures. I mean, all these top colleges now just give out this, and this should tell a lot of people something, right? Is they just give out a lot of the course materials for free. What does that tell you? Somebody made this point recently on LinkedIn, I think, which is like, a lot of the top colleges have made these courses open access, MIT, for years. The problem with a lot of this isn't the information. The problem is getting kids to sit down and learn it and be accountable. The information is mostly commoditized in the digital age. And so it should also tell you a lot that all these top colleges are putting stuff out there. That's not the main value of these colleges. In a lot of cases, this is not the content of the courses. So the value must be deriving from something else, right? It must be deriving from the peers. It must be deriving from the research opportunities, the networking opportunities. A lot of what other people would say that the value of these colleges are. It's not just the information of the courses. It's not that Harvard's class in organic chemistry is so special compared to any other college's class in organic chemistry. It's mostly the same in terms of the content. Obviously, different colleges move through the curriculum at different speeds. They can assume a much higher degree of aptitude for the students. It can be taught much more rigorously. You're, again, in a certain classroom, et cetera, et cetera. But organic chemistry is still organic chemistry at the end of the day. What I would say here is, for indirect candidacy building purposes, you can do whatever you want. If the student wants to just become educated in this field, they can do anything. They can watch YouTube videos, they could do Coursera courses, they could do edX, they can go find, again, video lectures if they wanted. They could go email professors and ask if they could sit in a class or get some of their materials, or if they wanted to. It doesn't really matter. The content is mostly commoditized, so I wouldn't be worried like the student is going to not be learning it. Again,
they have to be diligent and assiduous to actually go through the material, right? Again, that's the point that somebody was making on LinkedIn that I was referring to, is that the information's out there, but a lot of kids won't actually sit down in a seat unless there's a classroom and a teacher and a professor, and there's like accountability structure in a lot of cases, which will take me to number 2, or the second use case, because I think this will actually end up just knocking out all the use cases from number 1, which is more direct candidacy building. So this is more like the perception, or you're putting this in your file and you're sort of getting some admissions value from this, right? It's admissions officer facing, it's front end facing, and it's starting to be more direct candidacy building. That you want to, you could take college courses. I mentioned this a bit in the last episode when I was talking about for students whose high schools have some course rigor limitations, they can't get up to certain levels of classes. You can go take community college classes, or just at any college. It does not need to be a name brand college, because I think this is sort of what this person is asking to some extent. Like, what is the importance of the name brand or the perception? I don't think there's a big quality difference. Like, we've had a lot of students and they go take a statistics class at a community college or some SUNY or whatever it is, right? And it's 90% the same content. Again, if you were taking the class at Columbia, it's probably going to be taught faster. They assume a higher, prerequisite knowledge and math competence. They're going to get probably further into topics, more advanced topics. That is definitely true, but I wouldn't worry about it so much at this point in time. So community college classes, a state university system, totally fine. Admissions officers totally respect if you're taking classes at community colleges, if you're taking them through your state system. And that's generally what I would suggest on both fronts here, because the student will get the learning, they'll get the concepts, they'll get all the back end for the indirect candidacy building, intellectual vitality, to develop deeper knowledge in their field, the intrinsic learning. One of the issues with the sort of, the self-paced or the asynchronous or the Coursera or the edX or any of that, which is the accountability, there's not as much accountability there unless the student is very assiduous and very motivated. It's just very easy to let it go by the wayside, right? Or fall behind in the class because there's no tests, there's nothing on the horizon, there's nothing coming up. This will also solve the accountability problem from some of the Coursera and the edX. Now, if we have an advising students and it's like, we're creating the accountability and it's just, do this Coursera, and it's like, when you put that in to do, and like, you need to have done this number of modules, well, then we're creating accountability, right? But usually there's not going to be any accountability of the students doing it totally by themselves. There is some upside if it's very flexible, it's very asynchronous. You don't have to worry about, taking a college course that has an exam coming up over the summer and you're traveling and like, oh, how am I going to be able to take the exam on my laptop because I don't have internet connection, right? You are put into a much more structured environment. So like, it is a little bit more logistically demanding once you're actually in a college course, but it does eliminate that accountability issue that you have with some of the more self-paced online free, classes. So I would say, again, state system course, community college course, you have to always check with the college, what they require. Do they require a recommendation? Need to get something from the guidance counselor, from any teachers? Oftentimes they need to be a certain age to take a college course. So you have to deal with the registrar and, some of the administration, at a college. That would be a great option because it checks a lot of boxes. One, you could put it in the application. It's not going to usually go in the high school transcript because most high schools won't consider any external courses. They won't put them on the transcript. Not all, but most will not put it as a official class on the student's high school transcript, and certainly not with a grade, and basically never with a grade that would factor into the GPA because it's just from a different school. It's just very problematic. But you can put in the application, there is a spot in the application where you can list any colleges that you took courses at. You can send the official transcripts, which you should, to the college. So when a student's applying, you can order the official transcripts from the college, obviously assuming they did well. If they didn't do well in the courses, if they took 3 college courses and they got Bs, you might not want to include that at all in your application and just leave them as they were and just take the indirect candidacy building benefits of developing some deeper knowledge maybe in the student's field, but the outward appearance or extrinsic benefit would not be very high in that case because they didn't do well in the classes. One thing as an extra note here, just from a strategic perspective, is when I talk about fungibility versus non-fungibility, can you omit something from the application or can you not omit it from the application? You can't omit your transcript, but you can omit if you take college courses. So there's a shifted risk reward situation there. Right? Because in school, if you go take 5 APs and you end up overburdened and that results in you getting 2 Bs, that is very injurious and costly to your candidacy. This is the fundamental problem with the course rigor versus GPA balance. So I often say it's not a problem to be solved, but it's a dichotomy to be managed. It's a seesaw. It's a never-ending seesaw between course rigor and GPA. You're never going to be able to solve the problem. You have to take more difficult courses, but at the same time, you also need to get really good grades. And it's always riskier to take really rigorous courses because you could take a GPA hit. And if you take a GPA hit, it could all render it moot anyway because your GPA has just gone too low. And you just got a bad grade. You got 2 Bs. There's so many students out there who are over-indexed on course rigor. And I definitionally say you are definitionally over-indexed on course rigor if you have any Bs. Like that means you're over-indexed on course rigor by definition, right? Sounds very harsh, very unforgiving, but that's just the reality of the landscape that we occupy in 2025 now. Is that basically if you have any Bs, it's by definition means that you are over-indexed on course rigor. And of course, you can't just take 2 APs. The kids who are applying to the top colleges are taking 12, 14, 15, 17 APs, advanced TABIS classes, college courses. So you have to, even just to keep up in terms of the course rigor, you need to take a ton, but you also can't get Bs. So it's like you need to do both, right? Which is not easy to do, but there are tons of kids. Again, law of large numbers. There's 4 million students, so there are plenty of kids who pull it off, right? As I've said many times on the podcast, they just get through and they took 17 APs and they have, all A's and A pluses. So there is this sort of very significant risk when they're taking more challenging courses in the context of your high school, because you can't necessarily, now if you could drop the class and they don't see the grade, then that's totally fine. There's not as much risk there. But if it ends up that you just can't get rid of the course, you can't drop it, and it ends up going on your final transcript, that can just sink your candidacy altogether. One of the ways around that problem is you can externally take some classes and sort of dug around it, because if you don't do well in those classes, you don't necessarily need to send the transcript, right? And so that's more of a fungible, strategic maneuver versus the transcript is not fungible. So something else to keep in mind as well. There's different types of classes that you would want to take, at a community college versus you want to take them in your school. I'm not going to get too far down that rabbit hole. For classes that are just in your potential major down the line or that are hook relevant, you are going to be anthropology major. It's just like nearly no high schools in the United States have anthropology classes. Maybe some of the top private schools, some top boarding schools will have these very expansive course catalogs that look like a college course catalog, but most high schools don't have an anthropology course, right? So for something like that, that's a great use case to take at a community college or a state college. You are sort of further accentuating your hook and your intellectual vitality in that domain. And there's a real legitimate reason why you would be taking that course at a college versus if it looked like there was some gamesmanship that you were trying to get around, like an AP class, you were trying to get around, a core AP class that your high school offered. It looks a little different. We've seen a lot of students at high schools where instead of the AP course, which is more difficult at their school for a given subject, they take like the dual enrollment class or, whatever it is. And in that case, like it really depends on what courses you're talking about. But in some cases, the AP class at the high school is going to be a lot more rigorous than, the dual enrollment or even the community college course. It really does depend, but I think what we're mostly talking about here is relevant to the student's hook and their area. And in that case, like those courses usually aren't even offered by the high school in the first place. So totally valid and legitimate. Just take them as state college, community college, totally fine. You have a lot more flexibility and fungibility with whether you choose to submit those grades or not to the college. You report them in the application. You could submit the official transcripts. You're getting the intrinsic learning. I would not go crazy about what the content is and the syllabus and like, are they learning? It's like, it's not necessary, right? It's like that's sawdust, right? It's like most of these courses, if you're taking an intro, to stats or most of what most kids would be taking in a college anyway, it's calculus. Like calculus is calculus, right? Again, the difference at different colleges will be how quickly they move, what they demand of the students, et cetera, right? So of course there are still going to be some differences, but many students, if they're going to be pre-med, they have a calculus prerequisite. They still, over the summer, they still may go take it. They might be at a top 10, top 25. They finish their calculus prerequisite because it didn't quite fit into their schedule. They take it at community college over the summer, and they are at a top college, right? So there are just certain courses that I wouldn't get too into the weeds about the quality and the syllabus and the content. It's like, like a lot of these courses are pretty standardized across many colleges. So you're deriving all the back end benefits, the intrinsic learning, the exposure to the field. If you do that, you take one of those college courses and just, go sign up, go to college websites, the SUNY system in New York. You can look for the courses all across all the different SUNY campuses, for example. There's some system they have for that. But go to college websites, find a college course, they'll get the learning, they'll get the concepts, they'll get the exposure, the intellectual vitality, exposure to their field, they'll get the accountability, they'll get the structure, and then they'll also get direct candidacy building benefits. If it's relevant to their hook, it's further entrenching their hook and showing that they're seeking out additional opportunities to learn and additional courses because their high school doesn't afford them. To the students. So you're getting those direct candidacy building benefits. You get some metrics benefits, right? You can submit a transcript, a college transcript with some extra grades. You're beefing up your course rigor because now you have an extra college course or 2 or 3 or whatever it is on your main transcript, but this other transcript that you're submitting as well, so that would be factored into the course rigor. So that would sort of be my suggestion. You're knocking out 2 birds with 1 stone. If you went down the path of just doing Coursera and edX or one of these, it's like you're not getting the accountability, you're not getting a grade, you're not getting you can't send any official transcripts to the college. You're just not getting as much credit for it. Again, it's missing the accountability. So I would go more with taking the college courses. And again, it just doesn't really matter what the name brand of the course is. Like, there's just not, in many cases, for very core fundamental subject areas, there's just not going to be the extremely high degree of variance in quality. So I wouldn't really worry about all the nuances of that. It's not graduate school. It's a teenager. They're in high school. Like, you need to worry about that as much at this point in time. So all that being said, the courses I would say are a bit more, the college courses are more metrics aligned or hard factors aligned versus resume or soft factors aligned. They definitely do help to, again, reinforce the student's hook because they are through metrics, through classes, through external coursework. They are, building their hook. But if we sort of go back to the origin of this question, we're talking about summer programs, and a lot of people do summer programs. They view it a lot more as a resume builder or an extracurricular, right? And so you have to understand this use case of college courses is more towards the metrics of the application, or the hard factors of the application, your grades, your course rigor, your SAT or ACT scores. And it's not going to do as much. It will do some, right? It will do some. It will definitely help. It's like a watered down resume, but it's not accomplishing all of the objectives of what your resume is doing, right? So for one of the reasons why students' resume and the resume piece ties into the hook is because you really want to be pursuing opportunities that exist outside of structure. They exist outside of the classroom with a teacher hovering over you. Because that's really what signals to an admissions officer, like, real passion, right? It's like the student really had to take the initiative. It's not there was like somebody hovering over them and teaching them and there was a syllabus, right? You're not getting those benefits. It's not a student who's really going outside of structure or, just really taking a high degree of initiative, which is a lot more of the resume side. So I wouldn't really be thinking of these courses as a replacement for the soft factors of the resume piece. That is most of what drives the hook. There are metrics factors that drive the hook, right? So of course, if you're applying as the previous student and they're positioning for their hook is in English and creative writing, well, then you're going to look, did they take AP language? Did they take AP lit? I mean, all of your scores should be great on standardized testing, but if there was a little bit of disparity, is the verbal higher than the math? That's going to be more relevant. If you're an engineer, then the math is going to be more relevant, or the science on the ACT. You're going to be looking for AP Physics C, et cetera, et cetera. So the metrics do definitely figure into the hook, but a lot of the hook, by virtue of hooks being like the student's passion and what they really love and what they want to do and pursue and commit themselves to, a lot of that needs to come from their own initiative. It's not just taking classes and just constantly hitting metrics after metrics after metrics of grades, more numbers, SAT, ACT, right? More college courses. Like, that's fine to some extent, but these college courses are not a replacement for building a substantial resume that's relevant to your hook. And again, just referencing some past episodes, I go through the 10 ways to build an admissions hook in that episode. And so those are going to be the primary vehicles for building an admissions hook in the more primary way, which is through your resume. right? And through higher agency, higher initiative activities, right? Versus just taking college courses. And I will say there are a lot of kids out there that are very smart. They're very intelligent. They're very good at school. They're very good at multiple choice. They're very good at metrics, but they're not necessarily doers. I had this dichotomy, the intellect versus the doer. There are a lot of kids where it's like, they can read stuff and read an encyclopedia, but they're not doers. Like, they're not high agency, high initiative. They don't know how to leverage people or build a team or lead people, right? And so there's the spectrum, and I generally categorize a lot of the students, and they will usually conform to one of these archetypes, is the intellect or the doer. But the doer traits are really important. I think they're really important for life. Life is not a multiple choice test. You need to know how to interface with people, how to lead people. You need to be gritty. You need to network, send reach outs. You need to know how to do a Zoom interview with people. You need to present. You need to know how to be polished and articulate. Like, you can't just be book smart for your whole life. And so a kid who just is all metrics, and a lot of these kids there are a lot of kids because they are the intellect kid. They're not the doer. They're just all beefed up on just all metrics. They're just smart, but they don't have that real, they just can't see the real initiative or them existing outside of these metrics and this very rigid academic structure. You can't see all that passion coming through, the hook coming through. So you don't want to just be somebody who just goes and just keeps playing the metrics game. You do need to convey this passion and this initiative and this love through factors that are not simply just, these highly tangible metrics and grades and teachers and classrooms. You have to also build the soft factors in other ways through your resume as well. So reference that other episode as well for those are really much more the primary vehicles of building a resume. The college courses, again, they do help to substantiate the hook. They're much more towards the metric side or the hard factor side, and you do need to convey the student's initiative and their real passion in a less structured way, something that they are creating or driving or initiating much more so than just sitting in another classroom or another Zoom and following a syllabus and being good at taking multiple choice exams. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that answers the question. Number 3, third question and final one. Hi, I'm the parent of a high school junior, and we've been listening to your podcast, which has been incredibly informative. I was hoping that you might be able to talk about legacy admissions in your podcast. My child's father. So in this case, I will include some of the information because these are very specific colleges, and it does actually relate to answering their question. And none of this is going to risk the confidentiality. I won't ever include anybody's names or risk their privacy. So they say here, my child's father graduated undergrad from Harvard and I graduated from Emory. Do you have any insight into how much legacy status helps students nowadays, especially at Harvard with the litigation? And do you know how much it matters whether you apply early? Can you still get an admissions boost if you apply regular decision? I'm guessing that it varies a lot from school to school, but is there a way to know how much early versus RD will matter? After running the NPC, this is the net price calculator. So these are the financial aid calculators that a lot of the colleges provide for free, where you can sort of estimate what your expected financial contribution will be. We have financial reasons for not wanting to commit to ED at Emory. And of course, Harvard is such a long shot for anyone that we want to think about the opportunity cost of doing REA there. So REA, for those who don't know, is restrictive early action. That's what Harvard calls this decision plan, this way of applying to Harvard, restrictive early action. I've done an episode on this, single choice early action versus restrictive early action. The names are not used in the way that they should be. This is the problem of having there's no governing body over college admissions. It's all fragmented. It's all a bunch of private institutions doing their own thing. In a lot of cases, there's no central governance. Some schools call it restrictive early action, some call it single choice early action, but those mean two totally different things. So I'll just quickly break this down. Restrictive early action is a term that, even though Harvard and some of these other colleges do use it, what Harvard has is really a single choice early action policy. Single choice early action is you apply early to the school, single choice early action, and it blocks out all of your EDs. You can't put a binding commitment to any other schools, and you can't apply early action to any private schools, right? It's a very, very big opportunity cost. That's single choice early action. Harvard calls it restrictive early action. It's really single choice early action. Restrictive early action is a less reclusive plan, less of an opportunity cost, is less restrictive, and that's Notre Dame and Georgetown. And what that plan does, that restrictive early action plan, is just blocks you out from doing early decision or putting in a binding commitment to another college. It does not block you out from doing early action or putting a non-binding commitment to another college. So for anybody who's confused between the decision plans, I do have an episode on that as well. I don't like calling this plan REA, but that is what they are referring to. And Harvard's plan, again, just to be clear, is if you do what they call restrictive early action, but what we call single choice early action, you cannot do early decision to any other schools, and you cannot apply early action to any private universities. You can do EA to Michigan, could apply to the UCs simultaneously, but you can't do EA to Chicago, or you can't do EA to any private institution. So it blocks out the vast majority of your early options, early decision and early action included. So much higher opportunity cost, as this person is alluding to. For context, my child attends a public school in an urban school district, has a 4.0 unweighted GPA, and is on track to be a national merit semifinals with a 1520 PSAT score. I know from listening to you that we need to be working on how we frame her hook, but where I'm really in the dark is how to be strategic about the intersection of early action and legacy status. It would be amazing if you could talk about this on your podcast. Okay, so a lot of different questions. There are a ton of nuances in this question. And again, when I answer any questions on the podcast, you do have to understand, unless I've seen the student's entire application and their candidacy, it's not easy to make prescriptions about these things. You have to take some of this with a grain of salt, and I'll try to put asterisks where it's merited. So I'm going to start off by just going through, I want to break down legacy a little bit, school connections, broad tiers. First of all, when we talk about legacy, there's different kinds of legacy. I think most people intuitively understand this. There's just what I would call just baseline legacy, or just pure legacy. It just means your parents went to the college, and, what value is that from an admission standpoint, right? It's like your parent doesn't donate anything per se. You're not a development case. Your parent's not a higher up at the college. You have the parent who went to the college. It's pretty much it. That's just baseline or pure legacy. What does that do from the college's perspective? Why would they care? Why would they give you any admissions advantage if you're just a pure legacy or basic legacy? There's no donations to take into account, etc. So one is yield protection. So yield protection is the yield of a college is the percentage of students from those who are accepted that actually choose to enroll at the college, right? And so that figure is very important to most colleges, and they want to have a high yield. A college with the highest yield is the University of Chicago, which has about 88% yield, I want to say. Then you sort of have Harvard, Stanford, usually around that 80 to 85%. Almost all of the other colleges in the United States are like 40 to 60%, even the really top colleges. Maybe some of those top by like a Yale, Princeton, they'll have, might be 60, 70 in the 70s. There are very few that are 80% and above. It might only be those three in Stanford, Harvard, and Chicago. There might be one more, or that's very close. Maybe like high 70s or something. Maybe like a Princeton. Yale, I think, is in the 60s, I want to say. But most colleges, and just think about this, right? These are a lot of the top colleges in the United States, top 10 colleges, and they have 40 to 65% of the people that they extended offers to actually accepting their offers, right? And this is why early decision is so important. This is why some of these demonstrated interest signals, why do you want to go to this school essay, why do you want to study this major at the school? It's like all these little signals of where the student's actually going to enroll, but the most important of which is definitely doing early decision, because that is that's the ultimate yield production signal. Because it's protecting the yield by saying, I'm literally putting in a binding commitment and a binding obligation to come if you take me. Now, legacy helps with the yield as a yield protection mechanism, just because you have a closer connection to the college, right? So everything else being equal between two colleges, if you have a parent who went, or whatever relative that would, create legacy status. If you have a relative parent who went to that college, you might have grown up with some, familiarity with that college. There's a parent at least who might be rooting for you to go to the college. Some parents, didn't even like their college, or not think that the kid's a good fit for their alma mater. But on net, or on average, you're going to have a closer connection to that college. So between two colleges, one at which you have no legacy and another at which you have legacy, it's more likely that there would be a higher yield towards the college that you have a closer relationship to. So it is a yield protection signal to the college. That is why just like legacy without donations or any involvement at the school, or, being an admin or any of that stuff, that is why it is somewhat useful to the college. Then there's, of course, some sense of community solidarity, the identity. It's nice if you have multiple generations from the same family, et cetera, et cetera. I would say the most practical benefit, the most hard admissions benefit is it's a yield production signal. That's the pure legacy. That's the lowest rung on the ladder. Mom or dad just went to the school. They're not donors, they don't give anything to the school, and there's nothing really that significant past the fact that they just went to the school. And so that's going to be the lowest amount of benefit to a student's application. Then you move up to tier 2. Tier 2 is what I would call donor or legacy plus. Donor or legacy plus is sort of what it sounds like. There's a donation history here. Now, a lot of people wonder about, should I donate to my alma mater while my kid's in high school and they're about to apply? Admissions officers can see right through that. If you start donating to your alma mater, God forbid you start donating to a school that's not your alma mater, very transparent what you're doing. Very transparent. These people aren't idiots. So like you sending them a check for $5,000, $10,000, honestly even $300,000, you're going to get a thank you note back. And that's usually about it. If it's very insidious or manipulative, particularly if there's no reason why you should be donating to the school. But again, even if you're a parent, you went to this school, your student's now in high school, they're 2 years out for applying, you've never given anything to the college or barely anything, or there's a big incongruence or inconsistency, you gave $500 every single year since the time that you graduated, now you give all of a sudden $15,000, the year before your student is applying to that college. You have to really be very careful with optics. I've referred to this as baseline versus plot line. Baseline is just like the information. A lot of people, they just operate as though like admissions officers are machines. It's like you put a transcript into them, like you put a dollar bill into a vending machine. You put a donation into it, like you're putting money into a vending machine. It's like there's a human being there. And human beings are highly capable of reading intentionality and manipulation and what you're trying to do. That's plot line, right? Baseline is just like, I gave this amount. I have this on my transcript. But that's not what humans actually do. Humans are interpreting all of the context, all of the storyline, the plot line, the motives and the actors, what they're doing and what they're up to. It's not just the baseline donation amount. It's the plot line of what's actually going on here. What are they trying to do? You have to be very careful with some of these optics. But if you are a long-time donor and you've given, over a period of time, a long stretch of time, ideally since you've graduated, doesn't always have to be since you graduated the college. But, if you've donated for 10 years plus, even if it's only in the 3 to 5 figure amount, a lot of colleges do have respect for a lot of those donors. And there are a lot of them, right? There are a lot of donors not giving buildings, but, they might be donating $5,000 a year, $1,000 a year, and they might have done it over, a non-trivial stretch of time. Those are the next rung up on the ladder here. Would be the donor or legacy plus, you can refer to them. I would say more ideally 4 or 5 figures over a sustained period of time. 3 figures is getting on the lower end. And these are obviously totally pale in comparison to the major donations, which we'll get to in the next tier, but they are still non-trivial to the college. And it shows loyalty. A lot of different colleges have special membership or alumni societies for people who give at certain thresholds, and they're not whether you gave a building or not. And then it might also entail some involvement with the school, maybe some mid-tier involvement. It's not that you're an alumni interview, which basically means 0, but you're also not like a trustee, right? There's, maybe you have some involvement in the school that sort of falls between those two extremes, right? Being an alumni interview is not going to do anything. It's not any significant involvement at all, but you're not quite a trustee. Maybe there's some mid-tier involvement that you have in the school. I would sort of put that in the donor or legacy plus, or that's the second rung on the ladder. Third would be a development case or a major influence or major donor. So this would be somebody who's a trustee, somebody who has significant pull at the school. This would be a development case. Development case is going to typically be 8-figure donations and above. A lot of cases for the top Ivies, it's going to be mid 8 figures and above to be a development case. And this is obviously going to move the needle the most. And this is where you start getting into things where the meritocratic part of the process can be much more significantly compromised. The candidacy of a student could be much weaker compared to the normal admits as you move up the degrees of influence of the parents or the connections. Again, if your parents just went to the school, you're sort of on the lowest rung of the ladder here. You're just a legacy. It helps show some commitment, keeps the alumni happy to some extent, but you don't give anything anyway. So it's not, not their first and foremost priority. money. Tier 2, again, you have maybe a sustained donation record, not major amounts, but not trivial, maybe 4 figures, 5 figures over a period of time, or you've stepped it up over time. Maybe you gave $100, $300 a year right after you graduated, but you were a broke graduate student, and then you stepped up your donations over time and, give $10,000 a year, etc. Those are definitely non-trivial, and that's going to be the next step up. And this is not going to totally fundamentally change. You're not going to take a B student because you give $10,000 a year, but it's definitely more influential. And so these admissions officers will often have access to the development offices, the donation records, and they can see what the history of donations are alongside the application. And then again, the third is going to be the most rare and unique, and this is the one that, of course, can compensate the most for a weaker candidate, which is a development case or a major influence at the university. But again, it's going to be much more rare. You get into really crazy situations like Harvard Z-List, which are just really bad students that Harvard basically ushers into the school under the cover of darkness. They try to make it as though, it never happened. And these are really just students who don't belong at the institution, from any level of having gotten their way in outside of their connections or the influences. Now, in terms of this student seems to just be talking about legacy, like that first row. I didn't hear anything about donations. I feel like they would have mentioned that in all likelihood. And again, I probably would have mentioned if there was we've given $15,000 a year, they mentioned, some financial considerations. I'm going to assume that's not the case. I'm going to assume that they're sort of on the lower slider scale of the legacy. Parents just went to these schools. So that's something you have to take into account when you're considering admissions benefit. In terms of Harvard's rates, so the reason why I needed to talk specifically about the schools that were mentioned here is because Harvard is quite a bit of an outlier, not just from the fact that it's Harvard, but in terms of the legacy boost and the legacy stats. Between 2014 and 2019, the legacy admit rate for Harvard was 33% compared to the overall acceptance rate, which was 6% during that period. And a lot of this has come out through the affirmative action lawsuit against Harvard and a lot of stuff about Harvard's review process and these sort of details or these more nuanced data points or statistics. Colleges don't usually release most of this information. In 2025, they barely even release acceptance rates anymore. There's just very little transparency in terms of data. If you're trying to get really high quality data, very tiered data, what's the acceptance rate for legacies at this college for ED, and then what is it for ED2, and then what is it for, you have no access to that data. These colleges don't release this type of data. So we only have this data just because of what was leaked from some of the court cases. But again, during that span, 2014, 2019, so it is a little bit outdated. Some of this data is 33% versus 6% overall. So about a 5x versus the overall acceptance rate. Now, we don't know other confounds. So a confound is another variable that would co-vary here. Could be something else that would have caused the effect. So for example, out of those legacies, there can be students who are both legacy and they're recruited athletes. You can't necessarily attribute the effect in just the legacy status per se, and the recruited athlete status is going to be the heavier of the two hooks. Then there's just, some of those legacies, were they donors? Because then that's a different case, right? So if you're just a pure legacy, as I have referred to it, and then you're looking at data that sort of includes people with big donation records, right? That's different. You're not comparing apples to apples. Or there could be other hooks, right? There could be a student who their parent went to Harvard, but they're underrepresented minority, right? And so then they have another hook. The data is very messy, and it would be exceptional if these colleges would be super transparent and they would give you these really neat breakdowns so you could look very specifically at your case and be like, okay, this was the percentage of underrepresented, you could see all of the data and you could really start approximating and doing an apples to apples comparison between your case and, the past data. But this is not the case in admissions. There's very little transparency. So we have to understand there's other confounds in that data there's other legacies, but they might have been bigger donors. Their kid might have also been a recruited athlete. They might have been underrepresented minority. They might have been from an undersubscribed, an underrepresented state, right? And that's really juicy to a lot of the colleges. And this is where you get kids who can get through with less merit because they have other scarcity factors. What I, want to lead off with that point is it is definitely a significant boost historically for Harvard. It's much bigger versus a lot of the other Ivies. So Harvard and Princeton are the two Ivies that give the biggest legacy advantage historically. I'm not going to get into all the data because the data is just for lack of a better term, garbage. It's kind of between between these years. You can't see it broken down by what round they applied in. It's outdated. It's very messy, a lot of this data. But I'll just sort of say very roughly, Harvard and Princeton have given a much bigger legacy advantage versus a lot of the other Ivies, versus honestly just a lot of other schools in general. It's been much more like 5 to 6x. A lot of the other Ivies might be 2 to 3x, for example, versus the overall acceptance rate. So Harvard and Princeton by far have given the biggest legacy advantage. Now, this listener was also asking about how much these rates have gone down potentially over time with the litigation. So we don't know because we, again, don't have any updated statistics. And schools have, again, become increasingly non-transparent. So it was the first year in which Harvard didn't even disclose the early acceptance rate. A lot of colleges will not disclose certain things if, first of all, if the acceptance rate's very low, they don't want to discourage applicants because I've mentioned this game of they want to encourage as many people to apply as possible because then they keep their acceptance rate low, basically, right? It might be discouraging. They say like they don't want to stress out kids. It's all nonsense. It's just they're trying to get as many applications as they possibly can. So they didn't even release the early numbers this year. You're not going to see any updated data. This is not data that these schools want to put out there. The perception and the societal perception is very much not in favor of legacy admissions, particularly post-affirmative action. You're not going to find a lot of transparency or updated stats. Generally, in these cases, I would say that it's very likely it's gone down. As there's been more trends over time, there was a time where, the feeder schools, the boarding schools, those were the only kids who went to Ivies and Harvard. There was a time where the admissions officers, there was always a very direct and intimate relationship between the boarding school kids and, the Northeast and those admissions officers, the counselors of the boarding schools and the admissions officers at the top college, right? A lot of that's gone down over time. Public perception, notions of socioeconomic equality and access, and just the fight against, privilege and unequal access to these resources in these top colleges, right? So this data is still very much politically incorrect. So you're not going to find a lot of updated data here. I would generally assume if this has gone down, it's not 33%, maybe it's 25%, but we don't know. It's just conjecture. So in terms of Emory, we don't have any data. There's no data which I'm aware that Emory has ever released on legacy versus non-legacy. And this listener's asking even more specific questions, which is what does it look like for early versus RD, the legacy acceptance rate? So again, you're getting into very niche data that mostly doesn't exist. Now, it doesn't exist at all for Emory whatsoever that I'm aware of. Now, in terms of formal policies, there are some schools that have made statements about the intersection between applying early and being a legacy. The two most notable colleges over time that have made statements about this are Cornell and Penn. And so they have generally suggested it's very loose language and it's semantics and it's, the way they phrase it is very unclear. But they would say, to sort of get the full advantage of legacy, you'd have to apply early. Right. But the way that they frame it is, if you look at it, it's like Cornell said something a couple of years ago where they say the student's a legacy and they apply early, like that's going to show the greatest degree of, mutual commitment. And so they'll have the greatest odds of getting in. But it doesn't tell you anything because the mutual commitment's already shown by early decision just by itself. This is putting in a binding commitment. And they already would have a much higher odds of getting to the college if they do ED versus regular decision. So it's a confound, right? What is causing the higher acceptance rate is a legacy? Is it the ED? Well, we already know that the ED acceptance rate's much higher, and students who are doing early decision have a much better chance of getting into the college for many, many reasons. They haven't filled any of the seats yet. They don't know how many regular decision students they're going to get. They're much more nervous at that point in time. They haven't seen as many applications. You're much more likely to stand out. You're more unique. You get more time spent on your application. There are many fewer applicants applying during early decision. It could be 3,000 at Dartmouth ED, and then it's 26,000 in the regular decision rounds, right? So there's numerous benefits to applying early decision, as I've articulated already on the podcast. And so for an admissions officer to say, a legacy is going to have a much greater chance of getting in if they do early decisions, like no kidding. Anybody would have a much better chance of getting in early decision, right? So a lot of what Cornell and Penn and some of these other colleges have said historically, it doesn't mean very much, right? And it's just to their benefit or to their advantage anyway to get those students to apply early decision because they're putting in a binding commitment, which protects the yield. And it's to their advantage for that to happen. So there have been some of these statements. Penn has since removed the language. They used to have this language. They removed it from the website maybe I say maybe 2 years ago. This notion of, legacy is potentially having a greater advantage in the early decision rounds. Cornell is still, I don't know if it's still formally on their website, but there was somebody from admissions, say like late 2023, there was an article in the Daily Sun at Cornell, and they mentioned it, but the wording meant basically nothing. It was just, again, it was if a legacy does early decision, it shows the greatest amount of mutual commitment, but that's true for all students, non-legacy included. They'll have a greater chance of getting in. Again, that's true for all students, like, even non-legacies. I wouldn't put too much into this about this legacy and applying early. Now, is it nice? Is it a nice combination of being a legacy and applying early? I think so. Like, it's a nice thing to have. It's like what I was just saying, where you're compounding a few factors to your advantage. It's, if you have a parent who was an alum and, you're an athlete, or, the alum plus you're from a geographically underrepresented state, is like, you're sort of tapping into a few different things that the college likes or wants, or that are, nice. And so they do want to keep the alumni community strong. They don't want angry parents, as has increasingly happened, who send nasty letters, don't give donations anymore, won't go to the football games because their kid wasn't accepted. They don't want to do that. And a lot of people will know that a lot of, decisions are courtesy decisions, right? A lot of these deferrals or wait lists, their courtesy is to alums, or the legacy is sort of a softer way of putting down, the family in some cases. There's definitely some of those considerations. And so if the student is doing early decision, it just helps them make a decision anyway that they would like to make. They would like to reward the legacy and the parent having gone to the school. And ED provides them with a motivated, very logical reason for doing that or making that decision, because the student has put in a full binding commitment and fully committed to the college. And they haven't seen any of their applicants. They don't know how many regular decision applicants. They're always more in a scarcity mindset at that point in time. They're more anxious. If you divide up the amount of time for the ED review process or the early review process by the total number of applications, it's a much larger chunk of time and attention. They're giving 45 minutes in the ED round. They're giving 6 minutes in the regular decision round. But it's just, again, you look at the math, so there's 8,000 students or whatever it is who apply early decision to Duke ED, and they have from November 1st, but they also get applications even before then. They have, a month and a half. And then, they're getting, 60,000 applications or whatever it is, 55,000 applications. You're going 7x the amount of applications. And then you have deferrals from the ED round as well, right? So you're going maybe 8x, whatever it is for the regular decision, but it's not like you get 7 or 8x the amount of time to review those applications, right? It's not like they're spending a year reviewing the regular decision applications. Those are due in January, and most of the decisions come out by April 1st. So it's 3 months for about 7x the volume, 8x the volume of applications. There are going to be benefits for a student applying early, and it's going to be a bit nicer. They're going to be more able to give a legacy what they want and not sort of step on anybody's toes, because like the student's already doing something that is of value to the college, which is they're putting in a binding commitment and showing their full commitment to that college. And coming in again at a point, there's fewer applications, you're much more likely to come across as more unique, your narrative, your hook, when they've only reviewed 3,000 applications and when they reviewed 100,000 applications. So you're just going to get all of those normal benefits. In terms of it being, like you have to do early to get the benefits of your legacy, that's just not true or plausible. I think you can make a very compelling argument just logically that the yield protection that legacy gives, right? So I talked about how if your legacy, you have a closer relationship to the school, that means you're more likely to enroll. That becomes entirely redundant or subsumed if you do early decision. Because if you're doing early decision, you're already putting in a binding commitment. So that already protects the yield 100%, right? You're not getting any of that extra benefit out of the legacy. It's a bit strategically redundant, legacy and doing early decision. I do believe in the much larger pools in regular decision that it would be more valuable to the college to say, oh, this person's a legacy versus this is just Joe Schmo, basically who has no connection to the college, as a yield protection mechanism. That doesn't mean at all by any stretch that you're going to get in, or they're just going to take you because you're a legacy in that round, in the RD round, but you still do have that legacy label appended to you, and you still do have a closer affiliation to the college. So versus a student who doesn't, all else being equal, of course, things are never all else equal in admissions, but you're more likely to yield or attend in that very messy regular decision round. So the answer is here, we don't 100% know. We don't have very clear, neat, tiered statistics that remove confounds and all these other variables. You can't split test somebody who would have done a legacy applied early decision and what would have happened if they did, regular decision, because you don't know. There's always going to be comparison effects because you're read in a different round and you're juxtaposed against different applicants, right? So it's very messy. And so to some extent, it's not an answerable question. I think that a lot of the benefit of legacies who apply early, a lot of that does have to do with them applying early, and it's very difficult to separate the influence of the two factors because they're confounded and they're wed together. But neither one of these schools, by the way, these are not Cornell or Penn. Neither Harvard nor Emory has ever made any statement saying legacies are given some special treatment, or in order to receive any special treatment or admissions advantage, they have to apply early. Never heard anything from Harvard or Emory along those lines. In terms of these two schools' decision plans, so we talked about restrictive early action for Harvard, which again prefer the label single choice early action, and then Emory has ED. It not only has ED but has ED1 and ED2. The yield protection, again, as I said, of legacy is totally redundant at Emory because you're already putting in a binding commitment. So I already know you're 100% coming anyway. There's no yield protection benefit for being a legacy. That benefit's totally eliminated from any legacy status. In terms of Harvard, Harvard does block out a lot of your alternative choices, so it definitely does show a pretty high degree of commitment to Harvard if you're doing restrictive early action, because you've potentially suffered a pretty big opportunity cost of not being able to apply ED anywhere and then EA to any private schools. So you're suffering a pretty big opportunity cost, but it's not binding. They don't 100% know that you're going to come. But Harvard doesn't have a yield problem, right? Harvard's not worried about that a student's not going to come to Harvard. So the yield protection mechanism of legacy or the decision planning at Harvard is a relatively moot point anyway, because pretty much everybody who gets into Harvard goes to Harvard anyway. Now, in terms of a legacy who gets into Harvard, because you might sort of say, okay, well, we have legacy. How much of a benefit is that going to afford? You have to take into account two factors. One is what's the type of legacy? So that was the first conversation. The three types of legacy, as I mentioned, right? It's like, are you just a legacy? Are you a donor or legacy plus? Is there some significant school involvement? Do you have a substantial donation record or history? And then there's the big one, which is development case for major influence, trustee, etc. Right? It's obviously going to be a slider scale for the amount of influence or the admissions benefit that you're going to get, depending on which rung of the ladder you're on. But in this case, it just sounds like a pure legacy or a basic legacy. Right? So you're not getting anything basically from the yield protection because Harvard doesn't really care. They don't have a yield problem in the first place. Not a big issue for them. They're not a school that has a 45% yield. They have an 85% yield. If you get into Harvard, you're generally coming to Harvard. So not a huge boost from that perspective. And then you're not getting any of the other benefits of donor. It doesn't sound like students and athlete. It doesn't sound like there's any other big hooks here. And again, when I mentioned that 33% legacy acceptance rate, first of all, it is a little bit outdated. I don't think it's that high anymore. I would say that's probably, if you had to guesstimate, maybe in the 25% range. So it's non-trivial, certainly, particularly given that the Harvard overall acceptance rate is 3% and probably 7 to 9% usually in the early round. So it's definitely non-trivial. But in terms of we have to look at two factors. We have to look at what's the admissions benefit that's going to be afforded based on the type of legacy, the tier of legacy. Then second, the student's candidacy. How competitive are they for admission without any of that extra benefit? Now, in terms of a Harvard legacy who gains admission, it just depends, right? It depends on, what is the strength of the legacy or the donation record or how much influence of the parents, and then how competitive is the student despite that, basically. And so I'll say that a typical student who gets in, like, this is not an extreme outlier. This isn't a zealous case. It's not a development case, not a major influence. It's, a parent who went to Harvard. They probably give, some money to Harvard over a stretch of time. You will have a kid who will get into Harvard under those conditions who's not Harvard material, but they will still be a very competitive applicant. Right? So if your parent went to Harvard, both parents went to Harvard, obviously even better. And there's, let's say that you give, some money, you're sort of in this middle tier. You've given over multiple years a non-trivial amount, but not a huge amount. They might take a student who is top 5, top 10% of their class. They're, straight A's. They have a near perfect test score. They have a hook, a defined hook. They have several high value relevant extracurriculars to that hook. They have awards that are very solid awards, but not like game changing awards. If they've done research, it's not a student who like has 2 published papers. They're a student who's done research and maybe they won at like a local competition, but they're not, Regeneron top 10. Right. So it's a student who's usually a very competent or very good student on their own right. They've taken pretty much near the maximum amount of course rigor. They are top 5, top or 10% of their class. They're straight A students. They're nearly perfect on the metrics. They have a defined hook. They have high value extracurriculars, but they're not the type of student who would get into Harvard just on their own merit without their parents having gone or having that connection. Right. And so that student who gets into Harvard who just has no connection or no other admissions advantages due to legacy, that's just going to be a totally different level of students, right? You're talking about totally next level awards, next level uniqueness, right? Just next level, totally next level, major impact, major awards, or some major source of uniqueness. You can come from some other hook, right? It can, again, be underrepresented minority, underrepresented state. It could be athlete. Like, it's just where the scarcity has to come from somewhere. It's a scarcity composite. It's like a whole bunch of numbers, right, of like how scarce you are. So it's like we have all these institutional priorities. We need athletes. We need a diverse class. We need from different states. We need people to fill the undersubscribed majors. We want people who just like stand out and are different. And we don't have any of those. This is like a 1 out of 1. It's just a whole bunch of scarcity mechanisms, and you can stack them up basically and come to like some ultimate composite scarcity. So a Harvard admit who's not a legacy, they're going to have to get to that scarcity equation, whatever the math needs to be. Like, they are just a standout. Again, they have multiple published research papers. They have just like extremely unique positioning strategy. That's just a 1 out of 1. They're going to be extremely unique. And so that student who gets in to Harvard, who's a legacy, and maybe their parents donate a little bit, that they're not scarce enough where they would have gotten in. Some of those students, obviously some of those students they are truly exceptionally might have gotten in on their own merits. But there are a lot of those students who get in because they're legacy and they're donor, and they are still fantastic students. Like, you would look at the candidate and say, it's not that this kid just has like good grades and good test scores. Like, they are still a student who has a substantial theme to their candidacy building. They have a hook. They still have high value extracurriculars. You can't be expecting that just because you're a legacy and you're on the lowest rung of the ladder, that it's having a student who has good metrics, like the legacy is going to compensate. That's not the case. So based on everything that I've heard in terms of the student, I don't know barely anything because I have barely any information about the students, but it just sounds like they have good metrics. So they have a 4.0 unweighted GPA, a perfect PSAT score. So they're going to have top test scores. It's a great metrics student. But if you're just a legacy, and even if you honestly were a legacy plus or in that donor category, but like not major, this doesn't sound like, the fact that it sounds like still working on framing the hook, that there isn't a hook yet and already in junior year, tells me that this very low rung legacy of just a parent having gone to the school, plus the student just being mostly a metrics student, and like I think probably would have mentioned, if they had a really substantial hook that was built out over multiple years and had a lot of really high impact activities or really high impact awards, and if that is the case, then obviously it gets closer, but because you're closer in contention to being a Harvard student. But again, you're dealing with a bit of weaker on the rung legacy, and those nuances really matter. Like, I don't know what the student's profile looks like in terms of what those activities are. I don't know how unique their hook is. I don't know what awards they have, if any. I can't estimate their scarcity in the applicant pool. My inclination, just reading between the lines here, of just hearing about the metrics and it's sort of sounding like the hook is not really been extremely developed over time. This just sounds like a very strong metric student, and then like the lowest tier of legacy status. So this doesn't sound like a Harvard admit to me. So that would just be my perception. Again, I just don't have enough data or nuances in the same way for a lot of these questions. I don't know all the specifics of the student's case or their candidacy to be able to evaluate it. And then in terms of the opportunity cost that they refer to here, the opportunity cost of Harvard restrictive early action really will depend in this situation, because the opportunity cost for Harvard restrictive early action, again, single choice early action as we call it, it's going to be highest for the students where they're, for example, going to do early decision to Penn or single choice early action to Harvard, and they can't do both. simultaneously. And for that student, the opportunity cost of doing the Harvard single choice early action and not getting in is potentially massive, because they're not going to be able to do early decision at Penn. So now they're going to end up in the regular decision pool at Penn. What's likely going to happen is they're not going to get into either school. And what's likely going to happen is that they're probably not even getting into one of their top 3 or top 4 or top 5. And this happens very often. A lot of students who go single choice early action at Harvard or Princeton or Yale or Stanford, they just don't understand this major inflection points. Those top 5, and by the way, I need to start clarifying this for people, because all of these students, and I think parents, and I've done a really bad job of this, I keep saying top 5, top 10, and I think everybody keeps interpreting that, or students think of that as that's the quality of the school per se. Is that's the best school. The school that's rated number 1 is the best school in terms of the quality of the school. The only thing that's objective is the acceptance rates, right? The competitiveness, that is fairly objective. And so I can feel very safe in saying that the most difficult schools to get into in the country, top 5, quote unquote, and this is top 5 in terms of competitiveness. I'm not making a value judgment per se. I'm not saying that these schools aren't necessarily the top 5 in terms of value, but that entails a whole bunch of very subjective factors, right? The U.S. News rankings, if you actually look at most of the things that go into the U.S. News rankings, people don't care at all about any of those things that go into the U.S. News rankings. Research funding, percentage of Pell Grant recipients, those people couldn't care less. If they actually saw what went into the rankings, they wouldn't care at all about most of those factors. So it's very important to differentiate when I say these top 5, I'm talking about the competitiveness or the difficulty of getting in. Now, could you make an argument that competitiveness or selectivity is highly correlated with quality? Sure, but there is such a thing as fit. Like, there are kids who really don't like certain schools. They might hate Yale, right? They went to Yale and they hated it. And so for them, it's not going to be a top 5. It's not even, they didn't like it at all. And so value is very subjective. The competitiveness of the schools is much less subjective. I feel very confident in saying that Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Yale, MIT, and you can throw Caltech in there, even though it's not a very national name brand school because it's very niche. You kind of throw that one in there as well. Those are just a significant cut above the schools that fall below. And so you're talking about between a Columbia, a Penn, certainly a Brown, certainly a Cornell, like you are talking about significant multiples of difficulty higher to get into one of those, the Harvard, the schools that often have that single choice early action option. And so this creates a mega opportunity cost for people who go single choice early action after Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Yale, right? MIT doesn't have single choice early action, only has early action. And it's even worse for early action because there's no restrictions on the policy, which is, it's good in some ways. It just doesn't help you very much at MIT. So MIT has basically the lowest early acceptance rates. It's 5% usually. So Harvard's going to be 7 to 9, Stanford's going to be 7 to 9, Yale 9 or 10% in that early round. Understanding as well, there are a lot of students who are athletes in that early round and other special factors. A lot of athletes going to be applying in the early round versus the regular decision round. But when this person's talking about the opportunity cost, the biggest opportunity cost would be to somebody who could do ED to maybe a school that's top 15 from a competitiveness standpoint, but not in that total next inflection point, next inflection tier of those top 5 schools that I mentioned. They could do ED to Penn, they could do ED to Brown, ED to Duke, they could do ED to all of these amazing schools, but they're going to slightly try to cross up into this Harvard, Princeton, this type of tier, and they're going to find themselves in a race that's basically now 3x more competitive. I often say, well, is Harvard 3 times better than Penn? Is Stanford 4x better than Northwestern? Because that's probably the multiple of scarcity that you're working with in terms of the type of student who gets into Stanford versus one who gets into Northwestern. So you really have to start doing risk reward calculations. And I think a lot of the top schools, the very top schools, this is for a different conversation as well. They are overpriced from a risk standpoint, in my perspective, even though the people look at them as the highest tier schools and they kind of view it as winning, right? It's to the student who's a valedictorian. It's they want to be number 1 at everything. So they're just doing the same thing. They're just I'm number 1 in my class. So I want to go to the number 1 school. It's just it's winning to them. It's you could have a great company, You could have a great company, you could have a Google, you could have an Amazon, you could have a Tesla, whatever, but the stock is appropriately priced. It's not a deal. You're not getting a deal. It's a great company, but there's no arbitrage opportunity there, right? It's not like you're getting some, diamond in the rough, some needle in the haystack where you found this. That's really what I think is really interesting. That's what a lot of people do, is like finding very interesting arbitrage opportunities, finding something that's really underpriced, not significantly overpriced. And so even as great as some of these schools are, like Harvard, Stanford, they're also very overpriced from a risk standpoint. And, on the total opposite end of the spectrum, there are some schools that are great schools that are top 25 schools, top 20 schools, and they're very underpriced from a risk standpoint, very underpriced. So most people still won't listen anyway, and they'll still just apply. They'll do the single choice early action to those top 5 schools. They'll end up at their number 8 choice school. That just happens all the time because they can't make a decision to go to 1B. They got to go to 1A, and they have to take all of the risk. And so they'll pay the consequences. They'll pay the price, and they'll end up at their 8th choice school. Some of them won't even. They'll end up at 12. People don't understand the consequences of messing up this decision. So for a student who does have that ED to Penn or Brown or Cornell, whatever it is, that's maybe, only a top 10 or top 15, again, by competitiveness, I'm not going to make a value judgment. Again, I feel very confident in saying that those schools that I mentioned, Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, MIT, those are clearly the top 5 most difficult schools. Caltech is right there with them. Unequivocally the most difficult schools to gain admission to in the country. Much more competitive applicant pools, lower acceptance rates. If you're talking about a Penn acceptance rate that's 14% for ED versus a Harvard that's 7%, that's already a 2x, but then the applicant pool at Harvard is a much stronger applicant pool than it is at Penn. You start getting to a 3x, right, difference in terms of this, again, the scarcity or how impressive the student needs to be. And so those are clearly the top 5 from a competitiveness level. In terms of whether they're the top 5 from a value assessment perspective, they're definitely great schools, but that is a very subjective, according to what? Right? It's like, what criteria are we evaluating value by? If you start operationalizing that and you start saying, it's median, mid-career salary, whatever, okay, fine. Then we can start putting numbers to it and start making it very objective and operationalized. But most people don't really look at it like that. They're not just purely looking at it based on the salary data or whatever. If you want to say placements at top, IB or consulting or whatever, then sure, you can definitely make it a metrics game. And if you are very specific on a certain thing that you can clearly operationalize or turn into a metric, then you can probably start to come to a fairly maybe objective comparison on the value front. But I feel very uncomfortable saying that, when I say top 5, I think a lot of people misinterpret students or they get very upset because, they're not going to one of those. Like, they are exceptional compared to the national average. That is a different tier. It's a different tier for those schools. And it's not even things that are necessarily desirable. It's not even attributes that are necessarily even desirable. It's scarcity. It's scarcity. However you get to the scarcity, however you get to it, you get to it. I've met job applicants and I'm not super impressed by them at all, but I'm like, I know why they got in, because they were extremely unique. They were extremely unique. And that's it. Like that is a lot of what admissions is. So it's not even looking down on students and saying, oh, this is like, these are like a different tier. They're a different tier of rare, which is not necessarily to say a different tier in terms of being better. So I just wanted to clarify that. But the biggest opportunity cost will be for people who have an ED option, in that maybe top 10, top 15, top 20 tier, and they're going to forego that to do single choice early action to Harvard. They're going to end up missing on both schools, and then they're in the RD round at all the other schools, right? And then they end up at their number 8 choice school, or they end up at number 5 or whatever. Maybe Harvard was number 1 for them, but they're not getting into Harvard, and they would have gotten into number 2, but now they don't get into 1 or 2, and very often they don't get into 3 either. Again, they usually slip, right, by making that choice to go all out for single choice early action to Harvard. So that's the biggest opportunity cost. It's going to be for a kid who has another really good ED option that they like a lot, but it's not quite in that Harvard tier, and they have a good chance of getting into that, top 10, top 15 ED. Still not trivial by any stretch at all, that tier of school, but it's definitely still, again, a this non-trivial discrepancy versus the single choice early action schools and one such as Harvard. For this particular case, since they're already not doing ED, it sounds like there's financial considerations. They don't want to do early decision. The opportunity cost in this situation is less, because if it were coming down to doing, again, ED to Penn versus single choice early action to Harvard, there's a much bigger opportunity cost. And Harvard does black out all of the ED plans. But in this case, it doesn't sound like they're even willing to do ED. So it doesn't even, they're not foregoing ED at all, because they weren't even planning to do it in the first place, from what it sounds like. So the only thing that would be foregone in this case is the REA policy, or the single choice early action policy at Harvard, would block out early action to any private schools. And so this is, again, where I would need to see all of the schools, the students' ratings, to assess the risk reward, what their candidacy is, to make a judgment such as this, or even to be able to advise on it very much. Because you would need to know, what schools are they considering applying to? What schools do they like? Do they even have early action? Let's say the student didn't have any schools that they really liked that had early action. Well, there's basically no opportunity cost, because you're not doing ED anyway. And the student doesn't have any schools that they really like that would be blocked out for early action by Harvard. So then the opportunity cost is zero. So opportunity cost of one of these decision plans depends on the case. There are students who are in Canada who can go to one of the top Canadian universities. You go to McGill, you go to Waterloo, right? The MIT of Canada, as they refer to it. And you go to one of these great schools. That's a major school. They're much bigger, right, than these very small colleges, the Ivies, in many cases. And you go to a great school in Canada and you sort of say, I have an amazing safety blanket. So I have a very high floor, so I could take a much bigger shot at the ceiling. That's a unique case. If you're totally fine, if you're in Maryland and you have a really good chance of going to the University of Maryland and getting in-state tuition, and you're totally fine with that, you'd be thrilled if you go to the University of Maryland and you know you're totally in range. Obviously, you can never guarantee anything. So there's still some risk there that the floor sort of falls out from below your feet. But if you're in that type of situation, or you have the safety blanket, you're in Canada, you have the safety blanket of one of these, awesome Canadian schools, then you can take a really big shot and you can really go for it. And your risk tolerance could be much, much higher. Your risk appetite could be a lot higher. But it really depends on the particular case and what the whole picture really looks like. There are a lot of people who think that some schools are targets that really aren't. They're getting yielded. It's just they didn't apply. A lot of these schools, again, if you don't apply ED, you cannot expect to get into the school. It doesn't matter that it's clearly in range for you if you don't do early decision and then 70,000 kids apply rego decision. You just can never predict that you're going to get in. You should never assume you're going to get into a school rego decision. So I wouldn't actually say we don't know what the opportunity cost is here, but it's definitely lower than it would be for somebody who would be doing early decision, because that's not going to be precluded by Harvard's plan. And then again, if there's no other really compelling EAs that would be blocked out of private institutions, then that would also potentially reduce the opportunity cost to zero. So even though it doesn't sound like the student, and I'm not taking any shots at the student, it's just based on what was conveyed or what I'm reading into, I only see very strong metrics, but that's not going to be enough to get into Harvard, even with legacy. That's just the metrics. It's still, again, a student's going to get in with legacy. They're still a very impressive student. They have a clear academic hook, high value extracurriculars. They're not going to be the best kid in the world at math, but they're going to have some good, solid awards. They're going to have high value extracurriculars. They're very good candidates in a lot of cases who are getting in as legacy or with some minor donations. Again, assuming there's no major. If there's major parental influence or the parents have much bigger influence, then of course you can drop the merit of the student more because they can compensate more and fill in more of that void. But if you're just talking about parents just went to Harvard or they give some donations to Harvard, etc., it's like the student is going to get in where that's going to help them enough to push them over at Harvard is still going to be an extremely qualified student. It's probably the type of student who would get into, Penn for arts and sciences. Probably not Penn for Wharton, but it's probably a student who would get into Penn ED1 for arts and sciences, the main liberal arts college. But a kid who gets into Penn for, again, unless they were way overqualified for Penn, is not getting into Harvard, right? It's just a different tier of students. But what could close the gap between those two, right, of the kid who would get into Penn for arts and sciences, but now they've gotten to Harvard is, yes, they have some legacy, maybe there's some donations, right? But they still were an extremely compelling candidate in the first place. I'm just kind of getting the student has very strong metrics, but I'm not seeing the interactive influence here, just having very baseline legacy plus the student having strong metrics is that would be a winning ticket to getting into Harvard. It doesn't sound like a Harvard admit. That being said, if there's basically no opportunity cost, then sure. score, then, you can kind of do whatever you want because you have a free shot on goal. A lot of people will be in a situation where they're between doing an ED somewhere else or doing a single choice early action to one of these schools, and they will pay a very significant price of going after the single choice early action school. By definition, if you sort of say, well, what's that number? It's basically 90% of the people who apply to Harvard took that single choice early action shot and they miss because it's about a 9%, It's been 7% in some past years. They haven't disclosed it. Didn't disclose it this year, but assume 7 and 9%. So basically, by definition, 91 to 93% took a very costly decision plan and missed, right? It's like you can do the math for all of these schools. Like it's all about 90% of people took that very costly attempt and they missed. And what will happen for them? Who knows? Some people will be fine. They might end up still getting into the second choice school. They got waitlisted, but they somehow end up off the waitlist. Some people will get crushed. They will end up at their number 8, their number 9, number 12, their last choice safety school because they just messed up the decision planning. So it really depends on the student's case, what the opportunity costs and the risk. And then last thing I'll sort of leave off on here is, I really wouldn't, this listener is much more towards the later stages of the process. This is a junior, so I don't remember when they exactly emailed, but this is towards the later stages, the student's a junior. So it's definitely more reasonable to start thinking about the end game, so to speak, of applying and how you're going to do a decision plan and factors such as nuances such as legacy. But for most people, even if you are halfway through junior year and you don't have a really developed hook or really fleshed out resume, like that's a much bigger problem. Like you need to be spending most of your attention and energy worrying about that, not worrying about what your legacy admit rate is going to be. Because again, if we were to even try to assess the picture here and to say, what are the students' odds even at Harvard in the first place? It's like, well, there's only two factors there, right? It's like, how much is legacy going to help them? Well, first of all, I need to know what type of legacy it is. And for pretty much everybody, they're not going to be a development case or in that very top rung. But you need to look at the legacy and what would be the influence or the admissions benefits. And then, at a more nuanced level. But most of it's going to be what the student's candidacy is still. And so if you're wasting time thinking about, I've seen this from some people where they're just thinking about things that are not their first and foremost problems, right? It's like they have a major issue with their candidacy and they're worried about like minutia that just like doesn't really matter. And it's going to be a moot point anyway if you don't fix the really gaping hole in your candidacy. So I generally try not to worry about things until you need to actually worry and you've seen other variables, because a lot of these other variables are going to create additional contingencies. So for example, when we're talking about the opportunity cost of Harvard and we're sort of looking at that question locally and how do I answer this question about the opportunity cost in Harvard? Well, that's going to depend on what the other options are in terms of, do other schools have EA that the student would be applying to? Well, how are you going to know that? You have to visit the schools, right? And so it's like, you don't want to start doing these mental loops and mental exercises until you have other data that are going to be other contingencies that you've now basically resolved. So usually you don't, like we never in our process, we're never thinking about legacy. You might think about it a little bit when you're planning the school visits in 11th grade, because you might say this student is, they're on the cusp for this college. We're in December, January when we start putting out the school visits for our students. And I might say, the student's marginal for the school at this point in time, but they do have a legacy. And so you do need to take into account a little bit when you're planning the school visits potentially. We also need to be able to do that complex analysis of even knowing what they're arranged for in the first place. So you would need to understand their candidacy and have, case studies and be able to do that in the first place, which requires expertise. So you might do it at that point. You might think about legacy a little bit, but then outside of that, you're not thinking about the legacy, or these nuanced factors until you get to you're doing the final school list, the final decision plan. I mean, really, we just don't think about it a ton anyway. Like, you cannot become complacent. I've mentioned this multiple times. If you're going to be the kid or the parent or the family where you're going to say, we're legacy, so then in the earlier stages in 9th grade or 10th grade or 11th grade, we don't have to do as much. That's just terrible. It's a terrible mindset to adopt. It creates a complacent mindset. You think that you have an advantage, you're not going to do as much. Right? You don't want to be thinking that way. If you have an advantage and you know about it earlier on, I would just mostly, unless you're a development case or you're not getting it on your own merits, just ignore it. Just don't assume that you have any advantage and just operate as though you had no advantages. That's the mindset that would be the most useful to your candidacy in the earlier stages. Once you actually get to the final stages, now you actually need to do an actual accounting. Now there's an actual final accounting. The way that I sort of think about this, or the visual that I would use is It's kind of like being at it's a very weird analogy, but it's like kind of being at an arcade. So you're at Chuck E. Cheese's. This is a interesting analogy for a highbrow podcast on elite admissions, but you're at Chuck E. Cheese's, right? And so you're out there in the arcade, there are all the machines and there's the prizes. You're out there in the arcade and you're trying to get as many tickets as you possibly can, right? So you can get the best prize that you possibly can. The being out in the arcade and getting as many tickets as you can is all the earlier phases of this process. You're trying to get as many tickets as you possibly can because you don't know who's applying. You don't know how many tickets the other people are going to have, right? So what's going to end up happening is there's a whole bunch of people out in the arcade and they're all just playing the games and they're all racking up the tickets. And there's going to be somebody who hits the jackpot and they're crushing it and the tickets are just coming out left and right. And all of you at some point, there's going to be a bell that's going to ring or a certain amount of time. And all of the kids from the arcade are all going to have to go up to the booth and try to cash in those tickets for the prize. And that's the final accounting mechanism. That's when we count up all the tickets, right? And now we cash them in for the prizes. That's how I think about the final part of this process, where you do the decision plans, you apply to the schools, and you see what your tickets get you in terms of the colleges, which are the stuffed animals. When you're out there in the arcade, you're building your candidacy. You don't know how many tickets the other people in the arcade are building, right? They might be crushing it. They might be somebody who's just like spitting out tickets endlessly, right? And you have to try to get as many tickets as you can. That's the game. It's not to say, oh, you know what? I'm really good at this game. I have legacy, right? It's like you need to get the most tickets that you possibly can. It's a competition, as I mentioned in the last episode. Many people say it's a competition. Right? It's whoever does the most. So in the earlier phases, you don't want to be complacent. You don't want to look at your advantages and then allow that to compromise what you do or how many tickets you try to rack up. And then once you get to the final, once you actually go to cash in and get your prizes, and now you're in the application process, you're applying to the schools, you're deciding on the decision plans, now everybody's got to go and count up their tickets. The difficult part with admissions is you don't get to see other people's tickets. And the prizes, you don't know the number of tickets that's required for them. There is no like huge stuffed bear where it's like 1,000 tickets, right? And you're like, oh, I have 1,000 tickets, so I know I can definitely get the bear. That's not how admissions works. This is why you have to do the most, because you don't know who's applying. You don't know who's applying. The colleges don't even know who's applying. There's no admissions officer who even works in the department, is currently in the department, who could tell you if your application is definitely going to be enough at a future point in time because they haven't seen all the other applicants. So nobody knows. Now, based on historical trends and very accurate samples, based on having experience in case studies and having worked with people who've gone into Stanford, and, those are very representative samples that are probabilistically going to map onto who's likely to apply in the following year. But you could also have huge trends where there's just way more applicants or there's a dip or whatever. It's just the future. So you don't 100% know, right? There's also population trends and birth rates, and there's international, and there's all these different factors, right, that influence the applicant pool. There's shifting institutional priorities, affirmative action, post-affirmative action. There's all these other things going on. So that's really what admissions is like, right? It's like you don't know what the cost is of the prizes. You don't know if you have enough tickets. You don't know how many other tickets the other people have. But once you do that final accounting and you're up at the booth, that's when you have to really think about things like legacy. That's when we pull up the spreadsheet and we start looking at all of the factors of the student's candidacy, the strategic positioning, their exact academic transcript, because now it's basically final at this point in time by the end of junior year. You're looking at class rank, this spreadsheet of 100 variables. That's when you do the final accounting, and that's when legacy comes in, right? Legacy is one of them, alongside if they're geographically underrepresented, aside if they're an underrepresented minority, aside if they, what is our subjective estimate of their recommendation letters. Every single factor that will go into the application, every single thing that will go into determining whether they're getting an acceptance or not. That's when you do the final accounting, right? That's when you say, what is the legacy going to sort of get us here? But honestly, even when you're in that final accounting process, if I'm just thinking about this, like how much would I even think about this of the legacy and the early? Honestly, very little. The way that we mostly view legacy, because again, if you were talking about a development case, everybody understands that's a major outlier. And so of course that would just be an extreme outlier situation, right? But again, for most of the people, they just have legacy. Maybe they have a couple of generations, maybe they have both parents, but these are still some nuances, right? They've maybe given some money, but it's not major, it's not development level. These are all still within the same vicinity in the ballpark, assuming it's not an extreme outlier. And in most of those cases, the way that we would view it is we would only think about it again, maybe right before school visits if a kid is somewhat marginal, but we think the legacy would push the school to being in range. So we think we would send them on a visit. But outside of that point in time, it would only be the final accounting when they're actually applying that we would even think about the legacy and go through the 100 variables. And it's a much more minute variable. It's much more of like a tiebreaker variable. So if you have two schools, they're very close, you're making a very difficult ED decision. We had this happen with a student this past year, where it's very close between two schools, but there were two factors in favor of one. They basically rated the schools exactly the same from a value standpoint. You know, if we want to put them on a 10-point scale, they were basically like both 9.5s, both of these schools from a subjective value standpoint, but the student had legacy at one and not the other. And we also know that a lot of the students in their geographic region were going to have legacy at the other school, but they didn't have legacy at. So it was sort of a situation whereby at the school they didn't have legacy at, there were going to be a whole bunch of people who had a relative advantage because they did have legacy. And then, of course, at the school that they had legacy at, there are going to be students who don't have, you know, sort of legacy. So you're switching from a sort of like a +1 where you have legacy over a bunch of other students at the school that you have legacy at. Now you're switching to a -1, basically a difference of 2. Because now you're even lower than a lot of the other students who have legacy who we thought would be applying as well. So there was that legacy, and then there was another sort of strategic positioning variable as well, where, you know, the major was more unique, or the positioning was more unique and less the, you know, one of the main strengths of one of the schools versus the other. So those nuances can come into play, but you don't always end up with a kid who has two schools that are both 9.5s on their list. It depends on a lot of these other variables, but we only really think about the legacy in that final accounting mechanism and pretty much never think about it at any point along the way, because it's just, you need to ignore it. You can't behave or act as though you have an advantage, because it will, again, make you more complacent. So we only think about it at the end in that final accounting, and we really only view it as a tiebreaker. There's not a situation in which we would say, oh, the student is significantly, you know, there's a big margin here or a big gap for them getting in. And we're going to expect that because they have a parent who went to the school or, you know, has given $1,000 a year for the past 15 years or $5,000. That's going to be a game changer because the student has too much of a discrepancy to make up. So it's really only going to be in tiebreakers. You know, if the student's really quite out of range and there's a big opportunity cost there, you can't just wing it and just say, you know, because the student's a legacy, that we're going to be able to close this big margin and just hope that they get in ED versus the other school they could have done ED to instead. That would have been more viable. So you just can't be complacent, and you can't assume that legacy is going to be a major differentiator. It needs to be mostly towards the end of the process, and it needs to be viewed much more along the lines of a nuance and a tiebreaker versus like this student is very close to getting in, or they basically are at that level, and this will maybe provide them an extra margin of safety or get them in by a little bit of a greater, you know, with some margin of error. Or maybe if we suspect that they're a little bit below the margin for entry, a very small amount. But usually, like if the kid's not getting in out of their own merits, we mostly view the legacy much more as adding additional margin or additional safety blanket. Or, you know, we think that this kid has a 60% chance of getting in based on our assessment of their case of getting in ED1. Obviously, the school might have a 10%, 15% ED acceptance rate and a 5% overall acceptance rate. But our assessment, knowing the student's candidacy, is they have a 65% chance of getting in, but their legacy bumps them up to a 75% chance of getting in. Right? That's how we really want to be using it. We want to be using it for extra margin, not to try to close a really big gap in the student's candidacy and then burn through an ED. So that's much more, at least how we view it. That is it for this episode. I'm going to stop there since we spent a lot of time going through these questions. There's always different offshoots. There's always complexities, nuances. So we got to cover a bunch. Hopefully this was helpful to everyone, and we'll talk soon in the next episode. Bye-bye.